Chapter 1687. The Six Perilous Lands. Your ice-fire holy symbol is not complete, but my spiral stab holy symbol is complete. You are injured and your strength has been greatly reduced. How can you fight against me? The man with the ghost mask sneered and pressed his right hand down again. Instantly, the huge black cyclone completely swallowed the fire and ice lotus and Jiang Binghan. The masked man waved his sleeve and the huge black cyclone began to shrink. Finally, it turned into a cyclone the size of a thumb and fell on the masked man's fingertip. The two holy symbols have finally been collected. As he spoke, the masked man pointed his finger and the thumb-sized black cyclone spat out an icy blue and fire-red symbol. Looking at the ice-fire holy symbol in front of him, the masked man smiled brightly and could not help laughing. Even he didn't expect that the Wind Lightning Saint Talisman and Ice Fire Saint Talisman would be obtained so easily. This was really beyond his expectations. Now, all that's left is for the Sword Slave to bring back the lightning element of the Wind Thunder Holy Symbol and a trace of the Ice Fire Holy Symbol. The masked man said and disappeared from the small world. In the Ice Fire family's Life Tablet Pavilion, the Life Tablet that represented Jiang Binghan had been completely shattered. The Ice Fire family was in complete chaos at this moment. The shattering of Jiang Binghan's life tablet had almost caused the entire family to panic. Although the family head, Jiang Zuomei, was not in the Ice Fire family, the great elder, Jiang Zhe, was still there. He forcefully suppressed the chaos in the Ice Fire family, but even using forceful means could not disperse the panic in the hearts of the Ice Fire family members. In order to prevent the Ice Fire family from collapsing due to panic, Jiang Zhe had forcefully concealed the shattering of Jiang Binghan's life tablet. He had barely managed to stop the panic in the Ice Fire family. However, Jiang Zhe's heart was filled with bitterness and gloom. Although he had suppressed the matter, he knew that Jiang Binghan's life tablet had indeed shattered. In other words, Jiang Binghan had died. How could the ancestor have died? What the hell is going on? Jiang Zhe stood in the Life Tablet Pavilion and looked at the Life Tablet at the top. His eyes were filled with confusion and doubt. Jiang Binghan's place of seclusion was very mysterious. Even as the great elder, he was not qualified to know. Therefore, when something had happened to Jiang Binghan, he did not know where to go to find Jiang Binghan's place of seclusion. In the pitch-black abyss, a large hall was falling rapidly. The surroundings of the large hall were filled with dense and terrifying annihilation black wind. Rumble. Suddenly, the large hall fell to the ground, causing the entire hall to shake. The black wind of annihilation also dissipated the moment the large hall fell to the ground. The hall's ice fire. Zhuowen looked around and found that the bottom of the shattered nightmare abyss was still pitch black, and even his consciousness couldn't radiate more than 100 meters. It could be said that the darkness here could be called true darkness. Was? Zhuan flicked his finger and released 1,000 yellow spring water droplets. The yellow spring water droplets transformed into the yellow spring eye, floating above his shoulder. The yellow spring was formed by the 9 underworlds of the underworld, and the underworld was the darkest existence in the world. Therefore, the yellow spring eye formed by the yellow spring could naturally see through the darkness. The eye of the underworld's vision was filled with the color of blood. After all, the eye of the underworld was mainly used to distinguish the bloody light of sin. As such, its vision was very different from ordinary eyes. However, even though its vision was blood-red, Zhuan was still able to see the surrounding scene clearly. Zhuan was standing on a ring-shaped rocky ground. The surrounding rocks were rugged and steep. Above him, there was a dense black wind of dissipating destruction. These black wind of dissipating destruction were like wind blades, gathering layer by layer. That is, Zhuowen looked up with the eye of the yellow springs, and his eyes immediately became serious. Through the eye of the yellow springs, Zhuowen could see 2 figures rapidly falling from the black wind of annihilation several thousand meters above. Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei? Zhuowen's face was gloomy. He did not expect that the 2 of them would follow him into the shattered abyss. Kid, enter the passage ahead. Since the 2 of them still refuse to give up, they can't blame me for being ruthless. Xiao He appeared and pointed at the passage ahead with its little claw. Then, it turned into a black light and disappeared into the passage. Zhuan kept the Azure Dragon Palace and followed closely behind Xiaohe. Not long after Zhuan entered the passage, Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei suddenly fell to the bottom. The moment the two of them reached the bottom, the lightning ruler in Lei Qingtian's hand and the ice and fire reincarnation mirror in Jiang Zuomei's hand buzzed and completely shattered. The black wind of dissipating destruction is really terrifying. If you and I didn't work together, I'm afraid we wouldn't have made it to the bottom. Moreover, in order to reach the bottom, both of our earthly immortal saint artifacts were damaged. Looking at the completely shattered ice and fire reincarnation mirror, Jiang Zuomei sighed softly with a trace of pain in her eyes. At least we can capture Zhuan. These losses are worth it, Lei Qingtian said indifferently. Jiang Zuomei nodded and immediately looked around. After all, the two of them were earthly immortals. Naturally, their perception was much stronger than Zhuan's. Soon they found the passage ahead. The two of them looked at each other and turned into two long rainbows and plunged into the passage. A few days after Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei left, a fierce figure carrying a long sword on his back rapidly fell to the bottom. The person looked around and stepped into the passage without hesitation. The passage was quite long. Zhuan went through it at his fastest speed, but it still took him a few days to reach the end of the passage. The moment Zhuan walked out of the passageway, he was stunned. Outside the passageway, there was an incomparably huge void. There was no distinction between heaven and earth in this void. Whether it was the sky or the earth, it was all boundless darkness. It was like the universe in his previous life. In this huge void, there were huge rock fragments. These rock fragments were of different sizes. The big ones were hundreds of thousands of feet tall, like a continent. The small ones were only a few feet tall, only enough for one or two people to stand on. Countless rock fragments floated in the void, looking extremely spectacular. What are these? Is this the interior of the shattered nightmare abyss? Zhuan looked at the scene in shock. Kid, go to the west. I'll tell you about the shattered nightmare abyss on the way. Xiaohe said and turned into a black light, plunging toward the west. Zhuan followed closely behind. Soon, Nguyen stepped on the nearest rock fragment. It was not big, only about a few hundred feet. But the moment Zhuan stepped on it, an unconcealable aura of vicissitudes hit him in the face. It made Zhuan feel extremely small. Moreover, the gravity of this rock fragment was extremely strong. The moment Zhuan stepped on it, he felt a little unsteady. Fortunately, he reacted in time and did not make a mistake. This rock fragment, Zhuan looked at Xiaohe. At this moment, he sharply noticed that Xiaohe's eyes contained a trace of sadness. This rock fragment is from the main battlefield 10,000 years ago. You've just entered the Central Plains, so you don't know much about the 6 danger zones of the Central Plains, right? The 6 danger zones are the 4 main battlefields, the Nethercorps Extremis, and the Shattered Nightmare Abyss. The 4 main battlefields are located at the edge of the Central Plains. The Nethercorps Extremis is a sealed space. Only through the 4 main battlefields can one enter the Nethercorps Extremis. Only the Shattered Nightmare Abyss is located in the Central Plains, Xiaohe said indifferently. The fragments of the main battlefield from 10,000 years ago? Didn't they say that the battlefield was the Nethercorps Extremis? Zhuan asked doubtfully. Xiaohe glanced at Zhuan and continued, the main battlefield was very large. Back then, it was split into 6 regions. These 6 regions are the 6 danger zones of the Central Plains. Therefore, the Nethercorps Extremis and the Shattered Nightmare Abyss are both part of the main battlefield. Moreover, this region is where this Lord Dragon fell. Back then, the main battlefield was split and formed the Shattered Nightmare Abyss. This Lord Dragon was heavily injured and fell here. I stayed here for nearly 1,000 years. After recovering my vitality, this Lord Dragon went out again and entered the Nethercorps Extremis, intending to bury myself there and recover my injuries. Unfortunately, this Lord Dragon failed in the Nethercorps Extremis. You should know what happened after that, so there's no need for this Lord Dragon to tell you. Zhuan nodded. Then, with a burning gaze, he asked, so you're very familiar with this place? Are you sure you can kill Lei Qingtian and Jiangzuome? Xiao He raised his head proudly and said, "This Lord Dragon is much more familiar with the Shattered Nightmare Abyss than the Nethercorp's extremists. As a part of the main battlefield back then, countless experts above the earthly immortal realm died here, let alone 2 earthly immortals. There are many ancient restrictive formations here. Back then, this Lord Dragon studied some of them. If these restrictive formations are activated, it's enough to kill Lei Qingtian and Jiangzuome." Hearing this, Zhuowen's eyes lit up with excitement. He had never thought of killing immortals, even though his strength was comparable to a heaven-defying Saint Realm expert and he had the blood immortal, so he was not afraid of a half-immortal. However, in his mind, earthly immortals were still extremely powerful and unreachable. He had never thought of killing immortals with his current strength. But now, Xiao He's words had completely ignited Zhuowen's burning ambition. "Head west and you'll see a huge fragment of land there. There are several powerful ancient seals there. If I'm not mistaken, some immortal sages have fallen there. Perhaps you'll be able to obtain a lot of good fortune there," Blackie said in a deep voice. "That's right. You'll be able to obtain a lot of good fortune there." Hearing this, Zhuowen nodded. Then he spread his thunder wings and flew west as fast as he could. After flying for about 5 or 6 days, a huge fragment continent appeared in front of Zhun. Chapter 1688. Nirvana Slaughter Formation. The fragment before them was very large, even larger than the Wind Thunder Manor. Moreover, the gravity on it was also much stronger than the fragment that was several zhang in size. After landing on the fragment, Zhuowen looked around and found that there were broken walls everywhere, and there were layers of ruins. Zhuowen could even see the various traces of the ruins. It was not difficult for him to discern the grandeur of the ruins in the past. Xiao He jumped down from Zhuowen's shoulder. She stretched out her little paws and touched the ground under her feet. She said in a deep voice, "It's been so many years, but the fragment hasn't moved too far. It's just that the changes inside are quite big." At this point, Xiao He formed a seal with its tiny claws and slowly closed its eyes. Approximately 5 breaths later, it suddenly opened its eyes and called out to Zhuowen before flying off in a certain direction. After about an incense stick's worth of time, Xiao He stopped in front of a basin. The shape of this basin was very strange. It was actually in the shape of a footprint, as if this basin had been created by a giant beast. Xiao He stood at the entrance of the basin, his eyes flashing. He said in a low voice, "So it still exists. This ancient restriction formation is called the Nirvana Slaughter Formation. It is an extremely terrifying formation. Even earthly immortals might die if they enter this formation. It was very famous in ancient times." Having said that, Xiao He examined the surroundings of the basin for a long time before nodding in satisfaction. After such a long period of time, the Nirvana Slaughter Formation hasn't been damaged too badly. It shouldn't be too weak. Let's enter the basin and silently wait for Lei Qingtian and Jiangzuome. Xiao He glanced at Zhuowen, and then it tapped out repeatedly with its little claws. Instantly, the restriction ripples surrounding the entrance of the basin dispersed, and a passageway as tall as a person appeared. Xiao He called out and led Zhuowen into the basin. The sky above the basin was filled with lingering fog. It looked gray and hazy, like a cloudy day. When they arrived at the center of the basin, Zhuowen discovered that there was actually an ancient temple at the center of the basin. Due to the passage of time, this ancient temple was completely dilapidated. Even the eaves above had many holes. "Kid, this ancient temple existed in this basin back then. There are some notes and insights of an alchemist who specialized in ancient restrictions. If you want them, this dragon lord can help you get them," Xiao He said to Zhuowen. Zhuowen's Xiao He editor, Chrissy Formation. He said to Xiao He, "Of course I want them. My spirit avatar just so happens to lack experience and knowledge regarding restrictions. Once I comprehend it, I may be able to advance to the profound Saint Master realm." Xiao He nodded, and then it turned into a streak of black light and entered the ancient temple. Not long after, Xiao He rushed out of the ancient temple with a crystal skull in its hand. Then it casually tossed the crystal skull to Zhuowen and said, "The things are all in here. You can study them well." They will be quite beneficial to your mental power. After receiving the crystal skull, Zhuan casually looked through it. The more he looked, the more excited he became. This crystal skull recorded in detail an ancient restriction called the Devouring Curse restriction. The so-called ancient restriction was different from the restriction techniques of this era. Its full name was the Ancient Restriction Technique. Due to the disaster 10,000 years ago, most of the ancient restriction techniques had been lost. Thus, the arcanists of this era who cultivated mental power created the method of constructing origin formations using origin crystals. However, the ancient restriction technique didn't need to be like this. The ancient restriction technique was a powerful restriction technique that used mental power to quickly arrange a powerful origin formation. However, this method required a huge amount of mental power, and ordinary arcanists couldn't bear it. However, Zhuan was different. He cultivated the myriad evolution scripture, and his mental power was originally much greater than that of ordinary arcanists. Thus, it was quite suitable for him to cultivate the ancient restriction technique. Moreover, the Devouring Curse restriction was one of the top ancient restrictions. It included both the activation of restrictions and the breaking of restrictions. It could be said that it was broad, profound, and obscure. However, Zhuan believed that once he mastered the Devouring Curse restriction, most of the restrictions in the Shattered Elephant Abyss wouldn't be able to do anything to him. He might even be able to rely on the Devouring Curse restriction to comprehend some things and break through to the profound Saint Master realm. Thinking of this, Zhuan summoned his mental power doppelganger and tossed the crystal skull to it, while he silently observed the surroundings of the basin. This basin is very large. I wonder if there are any other good things in it? Zhuan glanced at the ancient temple, but he didn't plan on entering it. Before, Xiaohe had been extremely cautious before entering the ancient temple. He knew that the ancient temple wasn't simple. With his current strength, it was best not to rashly take risks. Kid, the area within 1,000 meters of the ancient temple is safe. However, you must not go beyond that, or you will be killed. Xiaohe saw through Zhuan's intentions and couldn't help but remind him. Zhuan nodded, then looked at Xiaohe and said, "Xiaohe, you are familiar with this place. Are there any other good things in this basin?" Xiaohe shook his head and said, "There is nothing else in this basin. The only thing that exists is this ancient temple. However, there are several ancient restrictions outside the basin. However, the ancient restrictions in those places are even more powerful than the ones in this basin. Back then, this Lord Dragon's injuries were too severe and my strength was insufficient, so I was unable to forcefully blast open those ancient restrictions. Furthermore, those restrictions were too complicated, so this Lord Dragon found it difficult to break through them." Speaking of this, Xiaohe glanced at Zhuan's mental power doppelganger and said, "If this doppelganger of yours can completely comprehend the Devouring Curse restriction, it might be possible to break those ancient restrictions together with this Dragon Lord. However, right now, it is simply impossible." Zhuan immediately became dejected when he heard that. He glanced at his doppelganger and curled his lips. "Looks like I can only concentrate on cultivating the Devouring Curse restriction first. Also, if I can comprehend the laws of the fourth restriction during this period of time, I'll be able to draw out the first mountain god. With the first mountain god here, things won't become so complicated." With that thought, Zhuan sat down near his doppelganger and silently breathed in the dense energy of the world. After all, the fragment continent was the main battlefield of the great battle back then. The energy here was far denser than the outside world. Even though much of the energy had dissipated due to its destruction, it was still much denser than the central lands. Time passed slowly. Very soon, half a year had passed. During this time, the fragment continent was extremely quiet. Zhuan and his doppelganger basically cultivated here. On this day, two figures flew to the fragment continent side by side. One of them was an old man with white hair and a beard, and lightning flashed on his body. The other was a middle-aged man in a white robe with a scholarly face. The two of them were Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei, who had been searching for Zhuan in the Shattered Nightmare Abyss. For the past half a year, the two of them had been searching in this void. They had passed by fragment continent after fragment continent, but they couldn't find any trace of Jun. This fragment continent is really big. It's the biggest one we've seen in the past half a year. Jiang Zuomei narrowed her eyes and said plainly, "Indeed. I just don't know if that little bastard Juan exists in this fragment continent." Lei Qingtian said in a deep voice. The two of them talked for a while and finally decided to split up and search the fragment continent. After all, the fragment continent was too big. If the two of them searched together, it would take too much time. Jiang Zuomei went to the east, while Lei Qingtian went to the west. The west where Lei Qingtian went was the direction of the basin where Juan was. Lei Qingtian searched very carefully. After about 4 hours, he arrived at the basin with the shape of a beast's footprint. There's a seal here. Where there's a seal in the shattered nightmare abyss, there's basically a treasure. Maybe there's something good in here. Looking at the seal on the basin, Lei Qingtian wasn't surprised. Instead, he was happy. In the past half a year, Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei had seen ruins with seals. Although Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei couldn't break most of the ancient seals, they could break some of the weaker seals or incomplete seals that were more powerful. They also obtained some good stuff from inside. Therefore, when Lei Qingtian felt the fluctuation of the seal in the basin, his eyes lit up. Walking to the entrance of the basin, Lei Qingtian stretched out his right hand. Suddenly, he was bounced back by an invisible ripple. His eyes were filled with surprise. There really is a seal. Moreover, this seal is extraordinary. If I were to enter the basin, I might be able to obtain some good stuff. Speaking of this, Lei Qingtian let out a long roar. His right hand turned into a blade, and terrifying thunderbolts swept out from his body, manifesting into a huge thunder blade. Then, the thunder blade left his hand and directly blasted on the restriction. Rumble! The seal shook violently. Immediately, the lightning blade collapsed. Then, an invisible fluctuation bounced back and swept toward Lei Qingtian. Lei Qingtian's face changed slightly. He roared and clenched his right hand. Lightning condensed into an extremely powerful lightning shield in front of him. Bang! This wave directly shattered the lightning shield, while Lei Qingtian spat out a mouthful of blood and was sent flying. His eyes were filled with shock. Isn't this restriction a little too terrifying? At this moment, Juan, who was sitting cross-legged in the basin, suddenly opened his eyes. Xiao He also floated out from his shoulder. It grinned and said, "Lei Qing, that old man is here. I didn't expect that instead of us taking the initiative to lure him here, he would take the initiative to court death." "Then, how do we lure this old man into the formation?" Zhuowen asked. Chapter 1689. Lei Qingtian's death. At this point, Xiao He's lips curled into a sly smile. Immediately after, it made a series of hand seals with both of its claws. Immediately, waves of invisible ripples appeared on the restriction at the entrance of the basin. Soon after, a crack appeared on the restriction, revealing a passage. Lei Qingtian, who was originally shocked and enraged by the power of the restriction, saw this scene and his eyes immediately lit up. He muttered in a low voice, "The entrance actually opened just like that? Could it be because I accidentally broke the formation eye of this formation just now?" Although he was rather puzzled by the strangeness of the entrance, Lei Qingtian's doubts were quickly replaced by passion. During the half a year in the Shattered Skull Abyss, he had already figured out the rules of this place. As long as there was a restriction, there would definitely be treasures inside. Moreover, the stronger the restriction, the better the treasures inside. After the confrontation just now, Lei Qingtian could feel that the restriction on the basin in front of him was very powerful. This also meant that the things inside were definitely not ordinary. Therefore, Lei Qingtian did not think too much and stepped into it. Lei Qingtian has entered it. Through the layers of restriction, Yuan saw Lei Qingtian slowly entering at a glance. As a part of the Nirvana Slaughter Formation's power was controlled by Xiao He could easily control the restrictions so that they could see Lei Qingtian's figure, but Lei Qingtian could not see them. At this moment, Lei Qingtian was in the restriction and appeared to be exceptionally cautious. His body was covered with terrifying lightning. These lightning constantly swam around his body, forming a rather spectacular lightning armor. When Lei Qingtian walked to the center of the basin, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. His pupils shrunk into needles as he stared in front of the basin in disbelief. In front of the basin, a young man with a cold expression was looking at him with a sneer. Zhuowen! Lei Qingtian could not help but cry out in surprise. However, the surprise on his face was quickly replaced by a ferocious expression. He sneered, "It's really a case of searching high and low only to find it by chance. I really did not expect to meet you here. In that case, it's time for you to die." As he spoke, Lei Qingtian took a step forward. Dense lightning burst out from the bottom of his feet, making him look like the god of thunder descending to the world. Zhuan stood quietly at the edge of the restriction with Xiao Hei on his shoulder. He did not take any defensive measures at all, as if he was not afraid of Lei Qingtian at all. However, at this moment, Lei Qingtian did not notice Zhuowen's strange situation at all. Zhuowen's times strange book times strange. He knew that he would kill the Zhuowen in front of him. He wind, lightning, ice, fire, sacred studio, and the ice, fire, sacred talisman, as well as the hall, the wind, lightning talisman, and the ice, fire talisman, as well as the hall, Lei. Bang. When Lei Qingtian was only a hair's breadth away from Zhuowen, a surge of enormous power instantly surged into his right hand. Immediately after, he let out a muffled groan and repeatedly retreated. His gaze was filled with uncertainty as he stared at Zhuowen in front of him. At this moment, an invisible ripple spread out in front of Zhu. There was no doubt that there was a restriction barrier in front of Zhu. How did he enter the other side of the restriction? Lei Qingtian frowned slightly. Only then did the eagerness in his heart slowly fade away. He began to think calmly. Not long after, his expression changed drastically as an extremely bad thought surfaced in his mind. Could it be that it wasn't a coincidence that the restriction entrance suddenly opened? Could it be that the real reason why he could enter the restriction safely is because he has mastered the restriction? Could it be that he deliberately lured me into the restriction? Lei Qingtian panicked. The more he thought about it, the more likely it was. In the end, he cursed inwardly and immediately retreated toward the restriction entrance. The moment he arrived at the entrance, his expression changed because the restriction at the entrance had already been closed. Boom, 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 boom. Lei Qingtian clenched his right hand and lightning turned into a blade as he slashed at the restriction in front of him. Then, an invisible ripple of energy spread out, causing Lei Qingtian to groan and retreat continuously. Lei Qingtian, stop struggling. The restriction in this basin is under my control. You can't escape. Zhuowen's indifferent voice resounded in the restriction. Lei Qingtian's expression gradually turned gloomy as he said coldly, "This is an ancient restriction. You're just a junior. I don't know what kind of luck you had to enter the central region of the basin. Now, you're actually trying to blackmail me. Do you think I'll fall for it?" Lei Qingtian, you're saying that I'm blackmailing you? Then watch carefully. This restriction is called the Nirvana Slaughter Formation. I'll let you see if I, Zhuowen, am blackmailing you or not. Zhuowen sneered. Shortly after, Lei Qingtian keenly sensed that the restriction around him had begun to tremble violently. Following that, rays of bloody light surged out from within the restriction array. These rays of bloody light were like snakes as they shot out and entangled towards Lei Qingtian. Get lost. Lei Qingtian snorted and blasted out his right palm. Suddenly, thousands of lightning bolts burst out and blocked the incoming blood-red light. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The moment the lightning blocked the blood-red light, an even more terrifying blood-red light emerged from the restriction. The blood-red light turned into ferocious beasts of various shapes and sizes. They roared as they charged at Lei Qingtian. The ferocious beasts formed by the blood-red light all had a terrifying aura. Even Lei Qingtian was frightened. With so many ferocious beasts charging at him at once, Lei Qingtian's face turned extremely ugly. In an instant, the ferocious beasts surrounded Lei Qingtian. Lei Qingtian roared again and again as he unleashed his attacks to destroy the ferocious beasts one after another. However, the blood-red light was everywhere. The ferocious beasts formed by the blood-red light were endless. As time went by, Lei Qingtian's face turned extremely pale. Even if he was an earth immortal and these ferocious beasts might not necessarily be his match, there was a limit to a person's strength. If this continued, Lei Qingtian would undoubtedly become very dangerous. Zhuan sneered as he watched the scene quietly. Days went by and Lei Qingtian was trapped in the restriction for a total of 49 days. In these 49 days, Lei Qingtian was like a machine. He fought tirelessly with the ferocious beasts formed by the blood-red light without any rest. Plop. Finally, Lei Qingtian knelt on the ground. His whole body was covered in blood and he was panting. He could not hide the intense exhaustion on his face. Even so, the ferocious beasts formed by the blood-red light did not have the slightest intention of stopping. Instead, they became even more ferocious. For a moment, Lei Qingtian spat out a mouthful of blood. His eyes were filled with despair. Lei Qingtian will remember you. Even if I become a ferocious ghost, I will not let you go. Lei Qingtian roared to the sky. A terrifying aura surged out from his body. This aura was getting more and more terrifying, like a volcano that was about to erupt. It was frightening. Lei Qingtian wants to self-destruct. Don't give him a chance. Your mind strength doppelganger should have mastered the devouring curse prohibition in the past 6 months. Follow me to seal Lei Qingtian. Xiao He squinted her eyes and instantly flew into the restriction. Zhuan waved his sleeve and merged the mind strength doppelganger that was sitting cross-legged on the ground not far away to comprehend the devouring curse prohibition. Then he followed closely behind Xiao He. Zhuan and Xiao He instantly flew above Lei Qingtian's head. At this moment, Lei Qingtian's face was flushed red and his body was faintly showing signs of swelling. The ferocious beasts that were originally entangling him exploded into a bloody mist one by one. Seal! Xiao He did not hesitate. She waved her little claws continuously. Suddenly, waves of sealing power turned into streaks of black light. Finally, under her claws, a huge shadow of a black tower was formed. Zhuan also formed a seal with his right hand and used the devouring curse prohibition. Streaks of illusory curse seals were imprinted on the surface of the shadow of the black tower, causing the shadow of the black tower to materialize. At the same time, the sealing power on the black tower became stronger and stronger. Boom! The black tower suddenly pressed down and suppressed Lei Qingtian. At the same time, Xiao He and Zhuan did not dare to slack off. They constantly strengthened the sealing power on the surface of the black tower. They knew very well that if an expert at the level of an earthly immortal self-destructed, the power would be enough to blow up the entire basin. As for Zhuan, who was in the basin, he would definitely be deeply affected. Xiao He and Zhuan lasted for half a day before they finally managed to completely suppress Lei Qingtian, who was about to self-destruct. The black tower stood quietly in the restriction as if it had taken root. Through the window at the bottom of the black tower, Zhuan could clearly see that Lei Qingtian was currently being sealed at the bottom of the tower by waves of powerful sealing power. He was motionless. Xiao He turned into a streak of black light and instantly entered the black tower. Then, Xiao He grabbed Lei Qingtian's dantian with her claws and pulled out Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit. At the same time, Xiao He used her own means to continuously cast terrifying seals on Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit. Very soon, Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit was completely sealed. When Xiao He flew out again, she passed Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit and spirit ring to Zhuan and said, Lei Qingtian is an earthly immortal expert after all. The power of his primordial spirit's self-destruction is extremely powerful. It's enough to kill an earthly immortal. You can use Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit to make primordial spirit lightning. When the time comes, you'll have another trump card to use against Jiang Zuomei. Hearing that, Zhuan's eyes flickered. He said in a deep voice, the devouring curse prohibition does have a method of using primordial spirits as raw materials to make a one-time use weapon. However, my understanding of the devouring curse prohibition is still shallow. I'm afraid the failure rate is very high. For now, I'd better seal this primordial spirit first. Xiao He nodded. Although it knew a lot about restrictions, it was not an expert in this field after all. Therefore, Its handling of the primordial spirit was probably not much better than Zhuan. Meanwhile, Zhuowen's spiritual energy clone was learning the Devouring Curse Prohibition. The Devouring Curse Prohibition was an extremely powerful existence among ancient restrictions. If Zhuowen completely comprehended the Devouring Curse Prohibition, his restriction ability would definitely surpass Xiaohe. Chapter 1690. Devouring Curse Restriction Small Accomplishment. Since Lei Qingtian has come to this continent, Jiang Zuomei should be here as well. I wonder where Jiang Zuomei is now. Zhuan narrowed his eyes and revealed a cold smile. For now, it's best not to provoke that Jiang Zuomei. After all, he's an earthly immortal. Moreover, that Jiang Zuomei might not be fooled into entering this restriction. You don't have to think about luring that Jiang Zuomei here. Xiaohe reminded. Zhuan nodded. Xiaohe was right. After all, he was still not strong enough. Moreover, the Devouring Curse had yet to reach the small success stage. It was really inappropriate for him to meet Jiang Zuomei. If he failed to lure Jiang Zuomei, then his whereabouts would be completely exposed, which wasn't a wise choice. Right now, what I need to do the most is to comprehend this Devouring Curse seal. If I can achieve initial success in it, then most of the seals on this continent will be nothing to me. When he thought of this, Zhuan suppressed his restless heart. Soon after, he sat down in the basin and began to seriously comprehend the Devouring Curse Forbidden Art. The Devouring Curse Forbidden spell was very different from ordinary forbidden spells. The Devouring Curse Forbidden spell was an ancient forbidden spell that condensed spirit force into various curse seals. It was a terrifying forbidden spell that was cast in the form of curse seals. Once the Devouring Curse seal reached great success, most of the seals in the world could be broken. However, it was still relatively difficult to reach great success. However, before comprehending the Devouring Curse, Zhuan searched through Lei Qingtian's spiritual ring. As the clan leader of the lightning lineage, Lei Qingtian must have a lot of good stuff in his spiritual ring. As expected, when Zhuan opened Lei Qingtian's spiritual ring, he found a large number of spiritual stones. Other than that, there were also many saint weapons. However, most of them were ascended saint weapons and profound saint weapons. Saint artifacts of that level were no longer of much use to Zhuowen right now. However, they were extremely precious to Zhuowen's family and friends. However, to Zhuowen's disappointment, there was no earthly immortal saint weapon in Lei Qingtian's spiritual ring. Lei Qingtian's lightning ruler is an earthly immortal saint weapon, but I can't find it in his spiritual ring. I think its probably immortal saint weapon was destroyed when he entered the abyss. Zhuan quickly guessed the reason. He could not help feeling regretful. After Zhuowen put away the spiritual ring, he sat down cross-legged, and the Devouring Curse's incantations started appearing in his mind. This time, he planned to go into seclusion to cultivate the Devouring Curse Forbidden Art. He wouldn't come out of seclusion until he reached the small success stage. This basin was undoubtedly the best place for seclusion. No matter how powerful Jiang Zuomei was, it was impossible for her to know that Zhuowen was in this basin. Even if she knew, Jiang Zuomei wouldn't dare to enter the basin because of the terrifying restriction in the basin. Is studio. On. Is too? Jiang Zuomei's white robe fluttered in the wind. He frowned and said in a deep voice, Lei Qingnan did not reply to me. Did something happen to him? Jiang Zuomei wandered around the fragment continent for a few days and didn't find any traces of Zhuowen. She then asked Lei Qingtian about the situation with the communication jade charm. However, the message she sent out was like a stone sinking into the sea. Lei Qingtian never responded. This gave Jiang Zuomei a bad premonition. Jiang Zuomei wandered around the continent for a few more months, but Lei Qingtian seemed to have evaporated into thin air. Jiang Zuomei had no choice but to leave the continent and head deeper into the abyss. After nearly a year of searching, Jiang Zuomei hadn't found any trace of Zhuowen, and she hadn't found the exit of the shattered nightmare abyss. For a time, Jiang Zuomei felt even more depressed. Not long after Jiang Zuomei left the continent, a man with a ghost face mask and a long sword on his back flew over and landed on the continent. That person looked around the continent, then left without even looking at it. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. Zhuan had stayed on the fragment for 3 whole years. During those 3 years, he had been doing his best to comprehend the devouring curse. On this day, Zhuan suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes were emitting a strange black light. The black light contained an extremely powerful devouring ability. Zhuan stretched out his finger. Instantly, his spiritual power transformed into a seal at his fingertip, which shot toward a huge rock in front of him. When the spirit force rune fell on the rock shrank at a speed visible to the naked eye. Rather than saying it shrank, it was better to say it was being devoured by the seal. The devouring curse seal, as the name suggests, not only has the ability to seal, but it also has the ability to devour. When the devouring ability is combined with the seal, the power is extremely shocking. This is the true essence of the devouring curse seal. Zhuan's eyes were filled with fanaticism. He had stayed in the basin for nearly 4 years. During these 4 years, he had been comprehending the devouring curse seal. As he comprehended, his understanding of the devouring curse seal's power became clearer. It was this clear understanding that allowed him to understand how powerful the devouring curse seal was. The fact that the devouring curse forbidden art could be ranked at the top of ancient forbidden arts was not baseless. When Zhuan's devouring curse seal reached a small success, the first thing he did was to take out Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit from the spirit ring. This primordial spirit contains celestial core power. This thing is much more powerful than saint power. Generally speaking, it's very difficult for a heavenly saint to absorb an extremely powerful energy like celestial core power. However, I have the devouring curse seal, so it's possible for me to devour it. Why don't I give it a try? Zhuan's eyes flickered. He was not in a hurry to refine the primordial spirit. Instead, he formed a seal with his right hand and cast a seal on the primordial spirit. At the same time, Zhuan's right finger tapped on the seal. Sizzle! Immediately, the sound of swallowing resounded. Soon after, Zhuan could clearly feel a surge of energy enter his body from his finger, causing his entire body to feel warm and exceptionally comfortable. Is this the energy of celestial core power? The energy contained in it is so rich that it's shocking. Zhuan's eyes were filled with surprise. In such a short time, Zhuan felt that the energy in his body had reached an unprecedented level. Moreover, his aura was constantly increasing. Soon, it rose to the peak of the true young saint stage. It requires an extremely large amount of energy to break through to the sky saint stage from the peak of the true young saint stage, and the celestial core power in this primordial spirit is more than enough. Zhuan roared and cast another dozen seals with the devouring curse. Suddenly, more than a dozen surging celestial core power turned into more than a dozen energy streams and poured into Zhuan's body. At the same time, Zhuan's aura grew rapidly. Zhuan's state of devouring lasted for a day and a night. Finally, his aura seemed to have undergone a transformation. The air around him rumbled continuously, and a chi whirlwind swept out from behind him. I've finally reached the Sky Saint stage. This celestial core power is really amazing. Zhuan laughed. He looked at Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit with blazing eyes. He knew that this primordial spirit was really a treasure. Moreover, Zhuan also found that after devouring celestial core power for a day and a night, the primordial spirit showed no signs of drying up. Instead, it was still round and full. Other than being a little dimmer, there were no major changes at all. Perhaps, the celestial core power that Zhuan had absorbed was just a drop in the ocean for this primordial spirit. With the devouring curse that I've mastered now, I should be able to start refining this primordial spirit. Zhuan's eyes flickered with determination. Then, he bit the tip of his tongue and spat out a mouthful of essence blood on the primordial spirit. At the same time, his right hand formed a series of seals. Immediately, a series of seals flew out and attached themselves to the primordial spirit. There were so many seals that they were so densely packed that they almost enveloped the entire primordial spirit. Under the sealing power of the seals, the essence blood that Zhuan spat out on the primordial spirit gradually merged with it. As for Lei Qingtian's consciousness, it had already been forcibly erased by Zhuan and Xiaohe during the sealing process. After the essence blood had completely merged with the primordial spirit, Jun could feel that there was a trace of connection between him and the primordial spirit. However, this connection was very weak, so Jun did not slack off. He began to deepen the sealing power of the seals to make the fusion of his essence blood and the primordial spirit more closely. Jun continued this refining process for 7 days and 7 nights. Finally, the connection between his essence blood and the primordial spirit was completely integrated. Jun heaved a sigh of relief. His face was slightly pale, but there was an excited smile on his face. This was because he could clearly feel the deep connection between himself and the primordial spirit in front of him. As long as Jun was willing, he could detonate the primordial spirit with just a thought. It could be said that the primordial spirit had merged with his essence blood. After being sealed by the devouring curse prohibition, it was completely under his control. I'm afraid this primordial spirit will become my final trump card in the future. Once this primordial spirit explodes, even earthly immortals will have to bear a grudge. I'm afraid even celestial immortals won't dare to touch it casually. Jun licked his lips and chuckled. Xiao Hei landed on Zhuowen's shoulder and looked at the primordial spirit with a hint of admiration in her eyes. She said, "It seems that your devouring curse prohibition has reached the minor completion. Not bad. It's time to go out and explore this continent. There are many seals and relics on this continent. With my devouring curse prohibition at the minor completion, it should be enough to break most of the seals." Zhuowen was full of ambition. He waved his sleeve, and numerous runes flashed out. In an instant, a passageway appeared in the restrictions in the basin, and then Zhuowen followed the passageway to the entrance of the basin. Previously, he had to rely on Xiao Hei to leave the basin, but now that he had reached the minor completion, the seal in the basin was no longer an obstacle to him. He could break it with a wave of his hand. Boy, it stands to reason that your mind power should have broken through since you've reached the minor completion, but you haven't. Xiao Hei stood at the entrance of the basin and asked doubtfully. Chapter 1691. Double Restriction. It's harder for an arcanist to become a saint than a martial saint. Once one becomes a saint, there will be a heavenly tribulation. This heavenly tribulation will definitely be more terrifying than the martial saint's heavenly tribulation. If I break through on this fragment continent, the heavenly tribulation will be too powerful. It will inevitably attract Jiangzuome or even the terrifying existence hidden in the shattered leaf abyss. This is not good for me. That's why I stopped my cultivation in advance and didn't break through. Jun explained with a smile. Xiao Hei showed a look of understanding and couldn't help but give him a thumbs up. "Kid, you're quite thoughtful. Let's go. I'm going to search this fragment continent. Maybe I can find something good." After saying that, Jun turned into a rainbow and disappeared from the entrance of the basin. This fragment continent was very big. Jun saw several restrictions as he passed by. These restrictions weren't strong and Jun could break them with a wave of his hand. However, Jun was disappointed that there was nothing in these restrictions. Even if there was, it had lost its spirituality due to the passage of time and was basically unusable. In the western part of the fragment, Jun stopped and frowned slightly. With his devouring curse restriction minor accomplishment, he could easily break through most of the restrictions on this fragment continent. However, he couldn't find anything good in them. However, Jun didn't come out empty-handed. With a flip of his right hand, a milky white crystal appeared in his hand. This crystal was called an immortal crystal. It contained rich immortal core power. This immortal crystal had unimaginable benefits for immortal sage realm cultivators. It could accelerate the cultivation of immortal sage realm cultivators. Jun also found that using immortal core power to activate the slaughtering finger of Acheron was much more powerful than using saint energy. After all, the slaughtering finger of Acheron was an immortal technique. It could only be activated with immortal core power. Even if the threshold of the slaughtering finger of Acheron was very low, it was no exception. There were more or less such celestial crystals in all kinds of restrictive formations. Jun had collected about 100 of them along the way. As for immortal crystals, there were actually many major powers in the central plains that possessed them. However, the amount of immortal crystals wasn't a lot. Basically, these major powers wouldn't bring the immortal crystals with them. Instead, they would store them in secret places. Only half-immortals and immortal sages were qualified to use them. Immortal crystals contained surging immortal elemental energy, which was enough to accelerate the cultivation speed of half-immortal and immortal sage experts. Coupled with the fact that they were rare in Middle-earth, they were precious to the major powers. Even Lei Qingtian, the patriarch of the lightning branch of the Windthunder clan, didn't have any immortal crystals on him. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but he couldn't bear to. Although almost 100 celestial crystals wasn't a lot, it was enough to cause many powers in the central region to covet it. Of course, even though the celestial core power contained within these celestial crystals was surging, it was still incomparable to Lei Qingtian's soul core. After all, Lei Qingtian's soul core was a genuine earthly immortal. Moreover, it was one of the best earthly immortals. The celestial core power contained within his soul core was enormous. How could a mere 100 immortal crystals compare to it? The war back then was too intense. Too much time had passed. If it wasn't for an extremely powerful treasure, I'm afraid it wouldn't have been able to withstand the erosion of time. Only these immortal crystals could be preserved until now, Xiao He said with a sigh. Zhuowen's eyes flickered as he said in a deep voice, Xiao He, didn't you say that you once found a restrictive formation trap that was even more powerful than the one in the basin? Where are those restrictive formations? Xiao He pondered for a moment before he said in a deep voice, back then, I did find 2 extremely powerful restrictive formations. However, the restrictive formations on these 2 restrictive formations were much more powerful than the one in the basin. Even if your devouring spell restriction had reached the initial stage, it would still be difficult for you to destroy those 2 restrictive formations. We can give it a try, Zhuowen said. Then we'll do as you say. Follow me. Those 2 restrictive formations are near the western region. Moreover, the 2 restrictive formations are not far from each other. Back then, I didn't learn any restrictive formation techniques. I was completely relying on my experience to break them. However, in the end, I returned empty-handed. As Xiao He spoke, he turned into a ray of black light and led Zhuowen toward the western region. Zhuowen followed closely behind Blackie. After around the time for an incense stick to burn, Blackie stopped moving, and a withered tree stood before it. This withered wooden stake was only half a foot long. Countless roots extended to the ground as if they were rooting. The withered wooden stake was very ordinary. However, such a withered wooden stake standing on a piece of barren land looked extremely abnormal. Hundreds of feet behind the withered wooden stake, a corpse was buried in the ground. Only the upper body was exposed. The corpse was wearing a leather armor. The surface of the leather armor was as smooth as a mirror. It was bright white and emitted specks of starlight. At a glance, one could tell that this leather armor was unusual. Boy, the 2 restrictive formations are here. One is the withered wooden stake, and the other is the corpse wearing leather armor hundreds of feet behind the withered wooden stake. Moreover, I suspect that these 2 restrictive formations are likely to be a series of restrictive formations. The 2 of them complement each other. It will be very difficult to break them. Xiao He sighed softly. Zhuowen narrowed his eyes and formed a seal with his right hand. Immediately, a series of seals shot out from his right hand. These seals covered Zhuowen's body and formed a defensive barrier. Then, Zhuowen took a step towards the withered wooden stake. When Zhuowen walked within 10 feet of the withered wooden stake, an invisible ripple spread out and forcibly obstructed Zhuowen's footsteps, preventing him from moving forward. Without hesitation, Zhuowen pointed his right sword finger. A huge curse character appeared from his fingertip and spread out. Then, the invisible ripple spread more and more violently. Zhuowen directly stepped within 10 feet of the withered wooden stake. When Zhuowen stepped within 10 feet of the withered wooden stake, a terrifying aura suddenly erupted from the withered wooden stake. The sky suddenly darkened as if Zhuowen had angered a god at this moment. Bush, bush, bush. In an instant, the withered wooden stake began to collide. It grew from 5 feet to 10,000 feet in size and turned into a towering tree. Withered vines violently swept out from the huge tree and wrapped around Zhuan in all directions. Zhuowen's pupils shrank. He pointed his right hand and the underworld water droplets turned into a defensive barrier in front of the vines. At the same time, Zhuan used the devouring curse seal to form a second defensive barrier. Boom, boom, boom. The vines swept over in an instant and blasted on the defensive barrier of the underworld water droplets and the curse seal. Immediately, a series of explosive sounds erupted. At this moment, Zhuan was very calm. He didn't care about the exploding underworld water droplets and the curse seal at all. His eyes were fixed on the towering tree as if he was observing something. Bang, bang, bang. After 5 breaths, the underworld water droplets and the curse seal completely collapsed. Then, the vines swept toward Zhuowen at lightning speed. Zhuowen's eyes were like torches. He suddenly spread out the thunder wings behind his back. With the help of the 2 laws of the void and the explosive steps, he suddenly disappeared from the spot. All the vines pounced on empty air. When Zhuowen reappeared, he was already at the bottom of the tree. He stared at the dense roots at the bottom of the tree with a resolute look in his eyes. With a wave of his right hand, the 9th Yangdao sword flew out and landed in his hand. Then he slashed fiercely. The blazing sun sword qi flashed through the roots. Then, the dense roots instantly exploded. The roots spurted out cherry red blood as if the roots were the meridians in a human body. Zhuowen's eyes were filled with surprise. However, he stomped his right foot and used the speed of teleportation to dodge the incoming vines. Meanwhile, Zhuan swept towards the roots at the bottom of the tree in another direction. When Zhuan held the 9th Yangdao sword and was about to slash at the roots on this side, an extremely strong sense of danger suddenly rose in his mind. Under the roots, a bony hand suddenly stretched out. This bony hand grabbed Zhuowen's 9th Yangdao sword. With a clang, countless sparks flew. Then, Zhuowen's pupils shrank. The 9th Yangdao sword was directly rebounded, and he also took a few steps back. After stabilizing himself, Zhuowen discovered that a skeleton in leather armor was slowly walking out from under the roots in front of him. This skeleton was the one with the lower half of its body buried behind the towering tree a few dozen meters away. When the skeleton finally walked out of the roots at the bottom, Zhuowen's pupils shrank. This skeleton did not have a lower body at all. Its lower body was actually formed by countless roots. These roots were connected to the towering tree like other vines and moved according to the tree's command. Bush, bush, bush. The skeleton slowly raised its head and looked at Zhuan. Its 2 rows of fleshless teeth opened slightly, as if it was grinning. Then, under the control of the roots, it suddenly rushed toward Zhuan. Along with it were countless vines. Zhuowen's expression changed slightly. With the help of his lightning wings, explosive steps, and void laws, he teleported again and again, dodging the countless vines' attacks. Even if some of the vines were about to reach him, Zhuowen twisted his wrist and the 9th Yangdao sword basically cut the vines. However, what gave Zhuowen a headache was the skeleton. The lower body of the skeleton was made up of many intertwined roots. Its speed was much faster than the vines, and it was able to catch up with Zhuowen every time. What made Zhuowen feel even more helpless was that the skeleton, which looked like it could break at any time, was actually as hard as iron. No matter how his 9th Yangdao sword slashed at it, it could not break. He did not know if it was the effect of the leather armor on the skeleton's body, but the skeleton looked as if it could break at any time. Bang! The skeleton whistled and instantly arrived in front of Zhuowen. Then, it threw a punch at Zhuowen. The eerie white bones brought with them a chilly wind as they flew towards Zhuowen's face. Zhuowen held the long sword in his right hand horizontally. After a clanging sound, Zhuowen let out a muffled groan and retreated continuously. Using the gap in his retreat, Zhuowen immediately used his fastest speed to escape from the restrictions range. The moment Zhuowen retreated, the towering tree slowly shrank. The skeleton also went back under the tree's roots and returned to the form of a withered tree. Chapter 1692. The 9 halls, the roots at the bottom of the deadwood pile, should be the core of the 2 restriction traps. As long as we cut off all the roots at the bottom of the deadwood pile, The restriction traps should be completely destroyed, Blackie said in a deep voice. Earlier, it had clearly seen the process of Zhuo when breaking through the restriction from the side, so it naturally noticed the unusualness of the countless roots beneath the withered wooden pile. It won't be easy to sever all the roots. Jun exhaled gently and calmed the surging vital blood within him slightly. After that, he stared at the restrictions before him. He was secretly deducing in his heart and using the devouring curse restriction to deduce the various transformations of the restrictions before him. These two restrictions are extremely powerful. It's impossible to break through them by force. If I didn't know the devouring curse restriction and possessed the speed of teleportation, I probably would have died to the restrictions by now. Zhuan revealed a look of understanding. Blackie had a look of admiration in his eyes as he echoed, with your devouring curse's ability to deduce, if you can deduce the weaknesses of this restriction one by one, then without triggering the restriction, you might be able to cut off all the roots under this withered wood stake. However, this is too difficult. Zhuowen took a deep breath and said, I'll give it a try. I'll definitely be able to break this restriction. As he spoke, Zhuan formed a seal with his right hand, and a seal shot out from the tip of his finger and landed on the surface of the restrictions. After that, Zhuan closed his eyes and began to silently sense the trajectories and weaknesses of the restrictions before him. Xiao Hei silently hovered behind Zhuan. Its gaze was fixed on the restrictions, but it did not disturb Zhuan. Time passed slowly. Zhuan sat there like this for 3 months. During these 3 months, Zhuan would frequently enter the restrictions to break through them, but he always ended in failure. Although he failed every time, Zhuowen's eyes grew brighter and brighter, and the restrictions became clearer and clearer in his mind. There was no doubt that the restrictions were extremely profound and complicated, but Zhuowen's tireless research during this period of time had allowed him to gain a deeper understanding of the devouring curse restriction. Moreover, his method of breaking through the restrictions had also improved imperceptibly under the influence of the 3 months of research. Ancient restrictions really are miraculous. They're clearly just strange energies constructed from the illusory mental strength of ancient alchemists, yet they've actually been able to exist for so long. Even now, the restrictions are still so powerful. At this moment, in Zhuowen's eyes, countless rune shadows flitted past. In Zhuowen's eyes, the restriction in front of him was like a countless amount of mind power following a specific trajectory, forming an extremely stable structure. It was precisely this stable structure that allowed the illusory mental strength to materialize. It also allowed the restriction trap to exist for tens of thousands of years without being eroded by the power of time. After 3 months of continuous practice and observation, Zhuan found as many as hundreds of weaknesses in the restrictions. However, these weaknesses were not critical. They were just insignificant. However, if Zhuan approached the withered wood stake using these weaknesses, he would not be noticed by the withered wood stake. It should work this time. Zhuowen's eyes flickered as he took a step forward. Immediately, he approached the withered wood pile by following the weak points in the restriction that he had found. Very quickly, Zhuowen approached within 30 feet of the dead wood pile. Previously, he had aroused the dead wood pile's vigilance within this 30 feet radius. The weakness within this radius was very obscure, and Zhuowen had to observe and practice for a full 3 months before he finally grasped the knack of it. Zhuowen pointed with the fingers of his right hand, and a rune flashed out and descended onto an area within a 10 m radius of the pile of dead wood. In an instant, the restrictions in the surroundings didn't resist at all, and the rune easily passed through them. Zhuowen took a deep breath and stepped on that spot. Then, Zhuowen used the devouring curse restriction again and again to point out the weaknesses of the restrictions in advance. Although it was only 30 feet away, Zhuowen spent 2 hours and finally arrived in front of the withered wood stake. Zhuowen waved his sleeve and immediately summoned the soul-devouring magma river, the first Yangdao sword, and the 9th Yangdao sword. Then, Zhuowen moved his mind and the 3 saint weapons were arranged in 3 directions. They turned into 3 long rainbows and slashed at the roots of the withered wood stake. Zhuowen's eyes turned cold. He pointed his right hand with the slaughtering netherworld finger and landed on the roots in the last direction of the withered wood stake. Bang, bang, bang. A series of muffled sounds were produced. Then the roots around the bottom of the withered wood stake all collapsed. In an instant, a shocking roar resounded from the withered wood stake. Blood gushed out from the bottom of the withered wood stake and turned into a bloody fountain. Under the shower of blood, the corpse hidden at the bottom of the withered wood stake rushed out and rushed toward Zhuan with monstrous killing intent. Only the last part of the roots left. Zhuan's eyes grew colder as he looked at the countless roots entwined around the lower half of the corpse. He formed a seal with his right hand, and the soul-devouring magma river, the first Yangdao sword, and the 9th Yangdao sword turned into 3 long rainbows and rushed out in front of the corpse. Bang, bang, bang. The corpse seemed to have gone mad. It tore with its claws and the surrounding space collapsed. The 3 saint weapons were stopped by the collapsed space. Zhuan took a step forward and bent his right index finger. Then he pointed down. 3,000 drops of yellow spring water turned into a yellow cyclone at the tip of his finger. A terrifying penetrating power leaked out from the tip of his finger. Ding! Zhuan pointed his finger at the corpse. The corpse let out a shrill shriek and swiped at Zhuan with its claws. The stench of a corpse assaulted Zhuan's face, causing him to frown. The two of them collided in an instant. Zhuan's long hair and robes fluttered despite the lack of wind. An enormous yellow spring sea appeared behind him, rolling and surging. It looked exceptionally horrifying. The sea of consciousness roared. Although the withered wood stake was destroyed and its strength was greatly reduced, the power that erupted from its body was still extremely terrifying. Zhuan's finger had gathered all of his energy. The power that erupted from the finger was terrifying enough to penetrate gold and crack stone. However, under the attack of the sea of consciousness, Zhuan was forced to retreat and let out a muffled groan. Immortal crystals! Zhuan growled and immediately took out immortal crystals from his spirit ring. After taking out 10 immortal crystals, Zhuan immediately crushed them. Waves of immortal core power surged into Zhuan's fingertip. Instantly, the power of the underworld finger increased by several times. The underworld finger behind him surged with huge waves. However, although the power of the underworld finger had increased by several times under the amplification of the 10 immortal crystals, the corpse was really too powerful. It was still able to erupt with a power that made Zhuan tremble in fear, and it still forced Zhuan to retreat. Zhuan's eyes were gloomy. He immediately crushed the remaining 90 immortal crystals in his spiritual ring and poured the surging immortal core power into the yellow spring finger. Bang! The vortex formed by the yellow spring's finger suddenly turned into a huge yellow vortex and bounced the crazy corpse away. Zhuan took a step in the air and teleported to the corpse's feet. With a twist of his right wrist, the yellow vortex cut off all the roots wrapped around the corpse's lower body like a sharp blade. Blood spurted out, mixed with the corpse's mournful screams. The corpse's right hand suddenly reached out and directly pressed on Zhuan's forehead. However, Zhuan was already prepared. He spread out his thunder wings and instantly landed several feet away from the corpse with endless thunderbolts. The corpse kept howling. Without the support of the roots, it fell to the ground and kept struggling. After the roots were broken, the dead wood pile gradually withered and eventually became ordinary and useless wood. The corpse struggled for about half an incense stick's worth of time before it completely stopped struggling and became a lifeless dead object. Zhuan retreated from the range of the restriction and coldly stared at the scene. After the corpse and the dead wood pile had completely become lifeless objects, Zhuan found clouds and mist emerging from the restriction. When the clouds and mist completely dissipated, the dead wood pile and the corpse disappeared and were replaced by a group of palaces. Zhuan knew that what the dead wood pile and the corpse had set up was only a restriction. Once the restriction dissipated, the true face of what was inside would be revealed. The group of palaces was the true face of the restriction. However, although the group of palaces was huge, it was a ruin. Although there were many palaces inside, most of them were broken. There are a total of 9 palaces, but all of them are broken. I wonder if there are good things inside? Zhuan frowned slightly, but he was the first to rush into the closest hall. After searching around the hall, Zhuowen was disappointed to discover that most of the things in the hall were damaged, and he could not find anything that was intact. However, the only gratifying thing was that there were a lot of spiritual crystals in the palace. These spiritual crystals were piled up everywhere in the palace. Zhuowen meticulously collected them. After Zhuowen had collected everything, he realized that there were nearly 1,000 immortal crystals in the hall. Zhuowen's eyes couldn't help but turn red at such a harvest. Let's take a look at the other palaces. After carefully searching the palace again, Zhuowen immediately rushed to the other 8 palaces. There was no doubt that the situation of the other 8 palaces was similar to the first palace. There were no treasures that Zhuowen expected. When Zhuowen finished searching the last hall, a sliver of disappointment appeared in his eyes. Apart from immortal crystals, there didn't seem to be anything else in the group of palaces. However, although Zhuowen was a little disappointed, he was also a little excited. This was because he had collected more than 10,000 spiritual crystals in the group of palaces. Such a number was absolutely shocking. Even the spiritual crystals reserves of the 9 great holy talisman clans were not much more than the spiritual crystals on Zhuowen's body at the moment. If people in the central region knew that Zhuowen had so many spiritual crystals on him, those old monsters in the big forces would not be able to sit still and snatch them. After walking out of the last palace, Zhuowen said with some disappointment, "It seems that only spiritual crystals are left here. As for the other things, they are either damaged or lost." Chapter 1693. Lone Peak, the position of the 9 palaces. Zhuowen took a step forward and instantly flashed to the center of the 9 palaces. He looked around and instantly noticed that the 9 palaces were arranged in a ring shape in 9 directions, whereas the doors of the 9 palaces just happened to be aimed at the center where Zhuowen stood. In the center, there was a large square, and in the center of the square, there was a small piece of soft soil. Zhuowen grabbed a handful of soil with his right hand, and his nose gently opened and closed. Suddenly, a faint celestial core power flowed out from the soil. Putting down the soil in his hand, Zhuowen's right hand suddenly reached into the soil half a meter deep and squeezed out a clump of soil. Immediately, Zhuowen found that the celestial core power in the soil half a meter deep was more abundant than before. "There's something under the soil?" Zhuowen's eyes flashed. He waved his sleeve and summoned the Blood Immortal. "Master, why did you call me out?" The moment the Blood Immortal came out, she began to suck up to Zhuowen with a flattering smile. Zhuowen pointed at the soil under his feet and said, "Dig this place out, but be careful. Don't mess around, or else I won't forgive you." The Blood Immortal's face turned serious. Although she didn't want to, Zhuowen knew her weakness, so she naturally didn't dare to disobey Zhuowen's order. "Master, don't worry. I'll dig it out for you immediately," the Blood Immortal said with a smile. After saying that, the Blood Immortal began to dig with all her might. Zhuowen, on the other hand, silently looked at the soil that was dug up. He was extremely curious. What was under the soil? How could this ordinary soil be stained with celestial core power? After about an hour, the Blood Immortal, who had dug to the bottom, suddenly screamed and jumped up. At the same time, at the bottom of the cave, there was a surge of terrifying celestial core power. The celestial core power was in the form of gas. Although it looked very thin, the celestial core power in the gas was very vigorous. Zhuowen took a step forward and landed in the air above the cave. He sat down cross-legged and began to absorb the celestial core power that was gushing out from the cave. The Blood Immortal who came out of the cave stared at the pillar of celestial origin Qi in front of her with eager eyes. She stole a glance at Zhuowen, and then tiptoed to the side of the pillar of celestial origin Qi. She absorbed the celestial origin Qi that was dissipating into the surroundings with an intoxicated look in her eyes. Zhuowen naturally noticed the Blood Immortal's little action, but he didn't say anything. The immortal essence that gushed out couldn't be stored. It could only be absorbed during the gushing process. Zhuowen couldn't absorb all of the immortal essence pillars by himself. The immortal essence that escaped would inevitably be wasted. It wouldn't hurt to let the Blood Immortal absorb the immortal essence that escaped. The celestial yuan qi pillar only lasted for half an incense stick's worth of time before it stopped collapsing. Zhuan slowly landed at the entrance of the cave, his cheeks flushed red. He had just advanced to the Sky Saint stage, and originally, he still needed time to consolidate his cultivation, but after absorbing the celestial yuan qi pillar, the consolidation process was completed. What's down there? How can it release such a dense celestial vitality pillar? Zhuan looked at the Blood Immortal and asked. The Blood Immortal scratched her head and said with a flattering smile, "Master, there's nothing down there except a corpse. The celestial vitality pillar came from that corpse. Master, you can go down and take a look." Corpse? Zhuan's eyes were filled with curiosity. He revealed a pondering expression, and then decided to go down and take a look. He jumped down and went into the deepest part of the cave. Landing at the bottom, Zhuan's eyes focused. Sure enough, there was a corpse here. This corpse only had the upper body, and the lower body was strangely missing. It was as if someone had cut it in half before it died. However, this wasn't the main reason why Zhuan was surprised. The main reason was that this corpse was exactly the same as the corpse that Zhuan had seen when he broke the formation and crawled out from the pile of dead wood. Especially the aura of this corpse, it actually made Zhuan's hair stand on end. A chill rose in his heart. This corpse was definitely not simple when it was alive. The owner of this corpse was very strong. He should have been a Sky Immortal when he was alive. I'm afraid he was also the owner of this palace. I just don't know why he died here and was buried under the mud in the middle of the square, Xiao He said in a deep voice. A Sky Immortal? Zhuan's expression changed. A Sky Immortal was already an ancestor-level existence of the 9 holy symbol families. Jiang Binghan, Feng Lei Wuji, and Jiang Binghan were such existences. To Zhuan, a Sky Immortal was undoubtedly an extremely distant and powerful existence. This kind of existence could kill Zhuan with a flip of their hand. It was as easy as killing an ant. And such an ancestor-level existence was actually buried here. It was very strange. If I'm not wrong, this person was probably one of the participants in the calamity 10,000 years ago. Later on, for some unknown reason, the palace he was in was breached, and he was cut in half by an even more powerful existence. Before this person died, he used a powerful restriction technique to set up this powerful ancient restriction. This restriction is extremely powerful and has survived until now. Xiao He's eyes revealed a trace of contemplation. Immediately, she turned into a black light and landed beside the corpse. After carefully examining it, her little claws suddenly reached into the ribs of the corpse. She fumbled around and took out a hexahedral crystal. What is this? Zhuan asked curiously. It's a storage crystal. It's similar to a spirit ring. In ancient times, there were no spirit rings. Most cultivators used this storage crystal. The best feature of this storage crystal is that it can be attached to the ribs of the body. It doesn't look out of place. It can be said that the storage crystal is much better than a spirit ring in terms of security, Xiao He said indifferently. Zhuan's eyes lit up. He said, "This storage crystal is so magical? Does that mean I can use it too?" Xiao He nodded and said, "Of course. Although the storage crystal is good in terms of security, once the owner dies, the brand inside will gradually disappear with the passage of time. Now, this storage crystal is an ownerless item. Take a look at what's inside." After saying that, Xiao He tossed the storage crystal to Zhuan. After Zhuan caught the storage crystal, he was rather excited. After calming down a little, he sent his mind into the storage crystal. Just as Xiao He said, the brand in the storage crystal had indeed disappeared. His mind easily entered the space of the storage crystal. After a quick scan, Zhuan immediately gasped. This was because he saw piles of fairy crystals in the storage crystal. After a rough scan, Zhuan found that there were a lot of fairy crystals in the storage crystal. There were at least 140,000 fairy crystals. In addition to the 10,000 fairy crystals that Zhuan had found earlier, Zhuan now had a total of 150,000 fairy crystals. Such a huge amount of fairy crystals even surpassed most of the major forces in the central region. Even though Zhuan had a strong will, when he saw the shiny piles of fairy crystals, His breathing could not help but quicken. "Boy, aren't you making a fuss over nothing?" Before the catastrophe, the martial Tao in the heavenly armor continent was extremely prosperous. Hundreds of thousands of fairy crystals were not considered a lot. Only in the central region that has fallen apart now would these things be treated as treasures. Blackie crossed its paws and looked at Zhuowen's shocked appearance with disdain, curling its lips. In that era when the martial Tao was prosperous, immortal crystals were actually as common as spirit stones now, and immortal crystals were even used as a unified currency. Of course, this currency was only used by celestial saints. After all, cultivators below the celestial saint realm did not have immortal core power at all. Therefore, fairy crystals were not very useful to them. Of course, for cultivators who had immortal techniques, even if their cultivation had not reached the celestial saint realm, fairy crystals were still very useful to them. After all, the immortal core power in fairy crystals could strengthen the power of immortal techniques. In addition to the piles of fairy crystals, One also saw many strange things in the storage crystal. However, he had never seen these things in the central region before. He was afraid that they were items from the ancient times. Moreover, the aura of these items was not very strong. Therefore, Juan did not care too much about them. Among them, Juan even found 2 Earth Immortal Sacred Artifacts and 1 Heaven Immortal Sacred Artifact. However, all 3 sacred artifacts were damaged and could not be used at all. However, Juan did not throw away the 3 broken immortal sacred artifacts. Instead, he kept them well. After all, they were immortal sacred artifacts. Even if they were damaged, the raw materials inside were still very precious. If he wanted to refine immortal sacred artifacts in the future, he might be able to extract the raw materials from these broken immortal sacred artifacts. Although Zhuowen felt that it was a pity, he did not think too much about it. Since the immortal sacred artifacts were damaged, there was nothing he could do. Zhuowen's attention quickly fell on a pile of bamboo slips in another corner. He opened the bamboo slips and found that they were all about the experience and understanding of ancient restrictions. There were even detailed explanations of the origin and principles of ancient restrictions. Zhuowen, who had learned the devouring curse forbidden art, had a new understanding and interpretation of ancient restrictions after he roughly read through the experiences in these bamboo slips. A dignified heaven immortal should have inherited some immortal skills. After putting away the bamboo slips, Zhuowen once again looked at the other places in this space. Soon, his gaze fell on a painting that was placed flat on a wooden table. It was an ink painting. There were only 2 colors in it, black and white. The painting was extremely monotonous. There was only a lone mountain in the painting. The lone mountain was surrounded by a misty fog. Apart from the fog, there was nothing else in the lone mountain. An ancient and lonely aura emanated from the lone mountain in the painting. The moment he sensed the ancient and lonely aura, Zhuowen's eyes revealed a trace of confusion. At this moment, he felt as if he was standing on a lone mountain. He looked into the distant horizon and found nothing else. Chapter 1694. Luring the snake out of its hole standing on this lonely peak, Zhuowen felt a unique sense of aloofness. Although this peak was lonely, it was extremely prideful in its bones. It did not associate with the other mountains, nor did it accompany the birds. From beginning to end, it was only a lonely peak. However, the pride in its bones made Zhuowen feel deep respect for it. The lone peak does not mix with the other mountains. It soars into the clouds with unending momentum. Involuntarily, a poem like that gradually appeared in Zhuowen's head. The poem appeared out of nowhere. It rang out in his head faintly, as if someone was murmuring it by his ear. Zhuowen slowly opened his eyes, and his gaze suddenly landed on the painting before him. Just now, he had been affected by the artistic conception of the painting, and as a result, he felt as if he was standing on top of the lonely peak, experiencing the feeling of being on top. The lone peak, Zhuowen murmured. A sliver of excitement appeared in his eyes. He had never thought that the immortal technique in his sea of consciousness would be hidden in an inconspicuous painting. The immortal technique you've obtained probably isn't simple. Moreover, the lone peak doesn't have an extremely low requirement like the finger of hell that you cultivate. It's very difficult to use this technique without the support of celestial energy. However, you have 150,000 celestial crystals and Lei Qingtian's soul, so you should be able to use it, just barely, said Xiaohei. Zhuo nodded. Afterwards, his consciousness swept out from his storage crystal. At the same time, he took out the painting. Zhuo Wen's eyes flickered as he stared at the ink painting in his hand. He said in a deep voice, "In any case, I'm not in a hurry. I'll cultivate this immortal art first. I wonder how powerful it is." With that, Zhuo sat on the ground with his legs crossed. He closed his eyes and began to cultivate the lone peak silently. Zhuo cultivated like that for 3 whole months. 3 months later, Zhuo slowly stood up. With a flick of his right hand, he immediately took out 10 celestial crystals and crushed them. Strands of celestial energy were absorbed by him through the devouring curse. Afterwards, he immediately used the lone peak. Immediately, the celestial energy turned into a spiral and condensed into a 10-meter-tall lone peak. The lone peak was filled with a strong sense of aloofness. As soon as the lone peak appeared, a terrifying force swept out like a storm. With Zhuo as the center, it swept in all directions. When the force spread to the 9 palaces seemed to be unable to withstand the force of the force and collapsed into dust. This lone peak immortal technique is truly powerful. Looking at the 9 palaces that had been shattered, Zhuowen's pupils couldn't help but shrink. This was merely the aftermath of the force emitted by the lone peak, yet it was able to shatter the 9 palaces. If the lone peak were to attack head-on, the power that would erupt would be unimaginable. After putting away the lone peak, the shock in Zhuowen's eyes didn't dissipate for a long time. The power of the lone peak was truly beyond his expectations. His physical strength wasn't strong. Although his cultivation base had advanced to the Sky Saint Realm, he could barely fight against a heaven-defying Saint Realm expert without the help of the 9 Yangdao sword. However, everything was different now that his physical body possessed the lone peak. Even if he didn't rely on the 9 Yangdao sword and the heaven-defying Saint Realm expert, he would still have the strength to fight against a half-immortal. Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei chased me so miserably. Now that Lei Qingtian is dead, it's time to lure Jiang Zuomei out. If I want to kill her, I have to kill her thoroughly. A trace of killing intent flashed in Zhuowen's eyes. He quickly flew out of the 9 palaces, but he didn't immediately enter the fragment continent. This fragment continent was extremely large. Even in the Broken Skull Abyss, it was considered one of the largest. At least, Zhuo had never seen a fragment continent that was larger than the one he was currently in. Moreover, there were countless restrictions of various sizes on this fragment continent. Zhuo used the Devouring Curse restriction to unlock these restrictions one by one. However, he didn't destroy these restrictions. Instead, he used the Devouring Curse restriction to connect the unlocked restrictions one by one. Zhuo stayed on this fragment continent for 2 months. During these 2 months, he had been searching for restrictions of various sizes. He found thousands of restrictions on this fragment continent. Of course, among so many restrictions, most of them were relatively weak or severely damaged. Restrictions that were relatively complete and powerful were extremely rare. When Zhuo connected these thousands of restrictions using the Devouring Curse restriction, Zhuo stopped at the center of the fragment continent. Zhuo heaved a sigh of relief. His face was slightly pale. Even with his strong willpower, Zhuo almost couldn't withstand the constant deduction of so many restrictions using the Devouring Curse restriction for 2 months. However, Zhuowen's eyes were filled with excitement. He murmured in a low voice, "If these thousands of restrictions explode at the same time, the entire fragment continent might collapse. Even an earthly immortal would die under the explosion of so many restrictions." So that's the case. No wonder you've been constantly looking for restriction spells in this continent for the past 2 months. No matter how big or small the restriction spells are, they don't refuse. So this is your purpose. Blackie flew to Zhuowen's shoulder and revealed a look of understanding. With the connection of the Devouring Curse restriction, I only need a thought to completely detonate the entire fragment continent. Zhuowen's eyes shone brightly. Now, all we have to do is wait for Jiang Zuomei to walk right into the trap. Zhuowen parted his mouth into a smile. With a wave of his sleeve, his mental energy avatar separated from his actual body. Immediately, a vast and mighty aura surged out from the avatar's body. Moreover, this aura became increasingly intense and powerful, faintly causing the fragment continent to tremble. Suddenly, the mental energy doppelganger flew high into the sky. The space around it shattered, and a terrifying storm burst out from the cracks in the space. If an ordinary person saw this storm, their sea of consciousness would immediately boil and be injured. This storm was a mental energy storm. It was invisible and intangible, and it targeted the sea of consciousness. Of course, the mental energy storm generated by Zhuowen's advancement to the profound Saint Master realm would not only target the sea of consciousness, but also the physical body. For a moment, the momentum in the sky above the fragment continent was extremely vast. It was as if a violent tsunami was coming from the sea, and a monstrous disaster could occur at any time. Most of the fragments in the shattered nightmare abyss were affected by this terrifying storm. Hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from the fragment continent Zhuowen was on a rather large rock fragment, a figure who was searching suddenly stopped. He turned around and stared at the vast spiritual storm with blazing eyes. Such a vast mental energy storm. I'm afraid that someone has advanced to the profound Saint Master realm. In this shattered nightmare abyss, other than me, there are only Lei Qingtian and Zhuan. However, Lei Qingtian is not an arcana master, so the only one who could cause this mental energy storm is Zhuan. This person was Jiang Zuomei, who was still searching for Zhuan. After losing contact with Lei Qingtian, he did not think that Lei Qingtian might have been killed by Zhuan. Or rather, he did not think that Zhuan could kill an earth immortal like Lei Qingtian. The shattered nightmare abyss was so vast that he thought that Lei Qingtian was planning to act alone and did not want to contact him. This kid is really careless. He actually dared to make a breakthrough here. It seems that the heavens want him dead. Jiang Zuomei laughed out loud. Killing intent was revealed in his eyes. His feet stepped on the empty air and shot out like an arrow that had left a bow. He rushed towards the fragment continent that was formed by the mental energy storm. The moment Jiang Zuomei shot out, a ghostly figure silently followed behind him. This person was wearing a ghost mask. His eyes were as sharp as swords as he stared at Jiang Zuomei's back. No one knew what he was thinking. What was even more surprising was that even with Jiang Zuomei's earth immortal cultivation, he was unable to detect the person wearing the ghost mask. This person's concealment technique was really amazing. An endless mental energy storm raged in the void. Zhuowen's mental energy doppelganger raised his head and stared at the mental energy storm in the void. He was not afraid at all and immediately activated the 4-kill sacred sword array. At the same time, he used the enormous mental energy cultivated from the myriad evolution scripture to resist the mental energy storm in the void. Devouring curse seal, myriad curse seal. At the same time, Yuan formed a seal with his right hand and repeatedly struck out in the void. Instantly, runes flew out with Zhuowen's mental energy as the medium. They transformed into tens of thousands of runes that looked extremely terrifying and powerful. These tens of thousands of runes were like a huge disk that flew above Zhuowen's head. Suddenly, the terrifying mental energy storm collapsed under the disk formed by tens of thousands of runes. Although the mental energy storm was getting more and more terrifying, the devouring curse seal that Zhuan cultivated was a powerful ancient seal. In addition, Zhuowen's mental energy was already very powerful. Therefore, the mental energy storm could not do anything to Zhuan. Suddenly, a sharp sound of something breaking through the air resounded outside the fragment continent. Moreover, the sound of something breaking through the air grew louder and louder, as if it was directly exploding in one's ears. The mental energy doppelganger narrowed his eyes and pointed at the void with his right hand. The disc formed by tens of thousands of runes suddenly tilted and landed on Zhuowen's left side like a huge shield. The mental energy storm against the disc turned into his means of attack and blasted towards the incoming sound of something breaking through the air. When Zhuan finished doing this, a cold snort swept over from the front of the runes. Immediately after, a dark shadow clenched his right hand, and terrifying ice and fire energy condensed in his palm and turned into a spiral-shaped ball intertwined with ice blue and fire red. Immortal Technique Ice-Fire Spiral. The ball in the dark shadow's right palm kept spinning and spinning faster and faster. Then he pressed his right palm against the rune disc. Crackle. Suddenly, dense sounds like firecrackers resounded continuously, and then the rune disc along with the mental energy storm collapsed. The pupils of Zhuowen's mental energy doppelganger constricted, but he did not panic. He held the devouring curse seal in his right hand and retreated repeatedly. Chapter 1695. The collapse of the continent. The black figure was none other than Jiang Zuomei, who had just arrived at the fragment. After destroying the thousands of seals set up by the spiritual storm and the devouring curse with the immortal technique Ice-Fire Spiral, Jiang Zuomei's momentum didn't diminish at all. She arrived in front of the mind power doppelganger in the blink of an eye and struck the doppelganger's chest with her right palm. The mind power doppelganger couldn't dodge, but the first Yang Dao sword and the ninth Yang Dao sword appeared and blocked the doppelganger's path. Boom, boom, boom. The first Yang Dao sword and the ninth Yang Dao sword were part of an earthly immortal's sacred artifact, so they were extremely powerful and stopped the ice-fire spiral. Taking advantage of the moment when the ice and fire spiral stopped, the spiritual energy doppelganger quickly retreated like a shuttle and merged with the main body. Bang! Jiang Zuomei waved her right hand and separated the first Yang Dao sword and the ninth Yang Dao sword. They fell back to Zhuowen's side. You've successfully passed the heavenly tribulation of a profound saint master with my help? You're pretty smart, but you'll soon find out that your fate will be extremely miserable. Jiang Zuomei smiled coldly and stepped on the void with his right foot. Then, like Mount Tai, he plummeted down. The ice-fire spiral in his hand spun violently and released a terrifying aura. Solitary Peak. Zhuowen pointed with his right hand and took out 100 immortal crystals. He crushed them one by one and absorbed the immortal core power that burst out. He then used the Solitary Peak. An ancient and prideful aura came from the void behind Zhuowen. Shortly after, a 300-meter-tall mountain appeared behind Zhuowen. It then rushed towards Jiang Zuomei to crush her. Jiang Zuomei narrowed her eyes and looked at Zhuowen's solitary peak in surprise. She could feel that the solitary peak was unusual. Due to Zhuowen's cultivation base, he couldn't unleash the full power of the solitary peak. However, the aura emitted by the solitary peak was far more powerful than an ordinary immortal technique. There was no doubt that Zhuowen's immortal technique was extraordinary. This kid is really full of treasures. If I kill him, I'm afraid there will be undeniable benefits for me. Jiang Zuomei's eyes were blazing. She didn't have the slightest intention of dodging the lone peak. She rushed forward while holding the ice-fire spiral in her right hand. Crack, crack, crack. Jiang Zuomei furrowed her brows as she discovered that the lone peak did not immediately crumble. Instead, there were only a few cracks on it. However, the aura of aloofness that erupted from the lone peak became even more intense and powerful. Pumph! Jiang Zuomei snorted coldly. The celestial core power in her body burst out and gathered on the ice and fire spiral in her palm. In an instant, the power of the ice and fire spiral rose to a terrifying level. Boom! Boom! Jiang was Jiang Li Tai's? Jiang Studio then Jiang was Jiang Studio of Jiang of Jiang Studio. Let's see what other tricks you can use. Jiang Zuomei grinned as she destroyed the solitary peak. She looked at Zhuowen as if he was an ant that she could kill with a wave of her hand. Zhuowen's gaze was extremely calm. He lifted his head and quietly stared at Jiang Zuomei, who had a sinister smile on her face. When Jiang Zuomei was only a few dozen meters away from Zhuowen, the corner of Zhuowen's mouth revealed a trace of mockery. Then, he pointed his right hand again and immortal crystals burst out from his spirit ring like stars in the sky. This time, Zhuowen took out so many immortal crystals that even Jiang Zuomei was shocked. She couldn't help but exclaim, "You took out 1,000 immortal crystals. How could you have so many immortal crystals?" Zhuan ignored Jiang Zuomei's words. He pointed his right hand and the 1,000 immortal crystals shattered. Rich immortal core power gushed out like a river. Immortal art, solitary peak. Zhuan's face turned red after absorbing the immortal core power of 1,000 immortal crystals with the devouring curse forbidden seal. With his current cultivation, it was a bit difficult for him to absorb so much immortal core power. However, he could still bear it with the devouring curse forbidden seal. Then, a huge amount of immortal core power poured out from his right hand as he performed the solitary peak again. At this moment, a lone peak appeared once again. This time, the lone peak that appeared was over 10,000 feet in size. It lay across the sky, and it looked majestic and magnificent. The ancient and proud aura that permeated the lone peak was like a violent gale and a tsunami that assaulted the face. Jiang Zuomei's expression changed slightly. This solitary peak was much more powerful than the previous solitary peak. Even she felt a little dignified. After all, it was a crazy move to perform an immortal art at the cost of 1,000 immortal crystals. Although Jiang Zuomei felt dignified, she wasn't afraid. She took a deep breath and gathered all the immortal core power in her body on the ice fire spiral. Then she pressed her palm down. Boom, 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 boom. As the two immortal arts collided, a series of muffled sounds echoed in the air. The power of the collision between the two immortal arts was really terrifying. However, the collision didn't last for long. Jiang Zuomei roared angrily and finally shattered the 1,000 feet tall mountain. However, it was still a bit difficult for Jiang Zuomei to shatter the 1,000 feet tall mountain. It wasn't as easy as it was before. The moment the solitary peak shattered, Zhuan let out a muffled groan. Blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth and his face was slightly pale. He kept retreating and instantly flew out of the fragment. Trying to escape? Let's see where you can escape to this time. Jiang Zuomei's eyes were filled with murderous intent. She continued to chase after Zhuan like a madman. Unfortunately, Zhuan didn't give her any chance. He formed a seal with both of his hands and instantly triggered countless restrictions on the fragment. Countless invisible ripples appeared on the surface of the fragment at the same time. These invisible ripples were like tough ropes that wrapped around Jiang Zuomei. Feeling the surrounding ripples, Jiang Zuomei's pupils shrunk to the size of needles. An extremely ominous sense of crisis arose in his mind. Following that, a gust of cold air rushed from the soles of his feet to his Tianling acupoint. Oh no! Jiang Zuomei raised his head and saw the cold smile on Zhuan's face. Jiang Zuomei knew this was bad. He took a step forward and planned to teleport away from the fragment. Unfortunately, the invisible ripples emitted by the countless restrictions had the effect of restricting the air. Jiang Zuomei's teleportation was in vain. Patriarch Jiang, you can go and see Lei Qingtan in peace. Jiang Zuomei still hadn't recovered from the shock, but Zhuo Wen's words made him tremble all over. Lei Qingtan is dead? He died in your hands? How could you kill Lei Qingtan? Jiang Zuomei didn't think too much about it when he suddenly lost contact with Lei Qingtan. However, Zhuo Wen's words made him tremble and he couldn't help but growl. Zhuo Wen's eyes were cold. He didn't want to waste any more time with Jiang Zuomei. Instead, he formed a seal with his right hand and the fuse that the devouring curse restriction left on the fragment was ignited. In an instant, the entire fragment was filled with a heavenly force. Then, thousands of restrictions on the fragment began to explode at the same time. With so many restrictions of different sizes exploding, the power that was produced was extremely terrifying. The fragment began to collapse and the surrounding space collapsed, revealing a dark and deep black hole. Countless destructive winds swept out from the black hole as if they could destroy everything in the world. At this moment, Jiang Zuomei had already flashed to the edge of the fragment. Unfortunately, the fragment had begun to collapse. An unbearably strong suction force was acting on Jiang Zuomei. Jiang Zuomei's face was filled with fear. The suction force was so strong that it made him feel as if he was facing the supreme heavenly force. He hadn't experienced such a feeling for thousands of years. No! Jiang Zuomei roared. His voice was like thunder that resounded in the void. Then, he was completely sucked in by the suction force. The fragment completely collapsed and began to explode. Boom, boom, boom. The collapse of the entire fragment produced an unimaginable amount of power. Even an earthly immortal like Jiang Zuomei was in danger of dying. Zhuan silently looked at the collapsing fragment. His eyes were cold and ruthless. He didn't have any pity for Jiang Zuomei. For him, Jiang Zuomei was simply reaping what he had sown. The collapse of the fragment continued for a full 4 hours before it gradually regained its calm. At this moment, the huge fragment no longer existed. Only countless floating fragments were left. Invisible ripples were like terrifying airwaves that constantly surged in the surroundings. Yuan summoned the first Yang Dao sword and the 9th Yang Dao sword. At the same time, 3,000 underworld water droplets were tightly attached to Zhuowen's body. Then, Yuan cautiously looked at the collapsed fragment. Although the explosion of the fragment had completely subsided, the powerful aftershocks still made Zhuowen's blood boil. If it wasn't for the first Yang Dao sword, the 9th Yang Dao sword and the underworld water droplets protecting him, Zhuowen would have been seriously injured as soon as he entered. The moment Zhuowen stepped into this place, he noticed that at the center of the countless fragments, there was an oval-shaped egg that alternated between ice blue and fiery red. However, the egg was severely damaged. There were cracks in many places. There were even a few large holes that revealed Jiang Zuomei's figure inside. Crack, crack, crack. When Zhuowen's eyes fell on the egg, it immediately cracked. Jiang Zuomei, who was inside, suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. His face was as pale as snow, and his eyes were extremely dim. At this moment, Jiang Zuomei's clothes were ragged. The left side of his body was badly mutilated, revealing his white bones. He fell from the egg to the ground and kept spitting out blood. The death intent in his eyes was extremely strong. Zhuowen slowly walked to Jiang Zuomei's side. He could feel that Jiang Zuomei's aura was extremely weak, and her eyes were filled with a strong will to die. Chapter 1696. Grimace in the dark. Jiang Zuomei spat out a mouthful of blood. He struggled to raise his head and stared at Tun. He wanted to say something, but found that his throat had been shattered and he couldn't make any sound. I've prepared this fragment for you for a long time. Don't blame me for scheming against you. If you didn't insist on pursuing me, I wouldn't have used such an extreme method to scheme against you, Zhuowen said indifferently. Jiang Zuomei whimpered. His eyes were filled with both shock and anger. He spat out another mouthful of blood. The death intent in his eyes became more intense, but there was also a trace of determination in his eyes. A terrifying aura suddenly spread out from Jiang Zuomei's body, like a volcano that could erupt at any time. Zhuowen narrowed his eyes and said in a deep voice, "Don't explode your primordial spirit. I didn't say that I must kill you." Jiang Zuomei, who was about to explode his primordial spirit, was stunned. He couldn't help but look at Zhuowen, but what he saw was a big hand. Zhuowen's right hand clasped Jiang Zuomei's Tianling acupoint. His left hand formed a claw and quickly reached into Jiang Zuomei's dantian, pulling out his primordial spirit. Then, Zhuowen made a series of hand seals and used the devouring curse to seal Jiang Zuomei's primordial spirit. Then, Zhuowen stuffed him into the spiritual ring. Zhuowen did this series of actions in one breath. He was so fast that Jiang Zuomei didn't even have time to react before he was sealed by Zhuowen. Fortunately, I stopped Jiang Zuomei's self-explosion in time. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. Although the series of actions just now had been completed in an instant, Zhuowen almost broke out in a cold sweat. He was very clear that if his actions were any slower, Jiang Zuomei would immediately react and self-destruct her soul. Zhuowen would definitely die if the primordial spirit of an earthly immortal realm expert exploded. Finally, Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei, these two hidden dangers, are dealt with. Zhuowen heaved a sigh of relief. A relaxed smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. At the same time, a trace of pride emerged in his heart. In his eyes, earthly immortals were simply unattainable existences. But now, he was only in the Sky Saint realm, and he was able to kill Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei, these two earthly immortals. How magnificent was this feat! If this matter were to spread to the Central Plains, Zhuowen would definitely become a legend. Because there was no one in the Central Continent, the immortal realm expert, who could kill immortals. Even Yuan Hongwen, the divine prince of the chaotic temple, had only defeated an earthly immortal when he was in the half-immortal realm. Although Zhuowen now that the two hidden dangers have been dealt with, how do I leave this abyss of broken centipede? Zhuowen asked Xiao He. Go deep into the abyss of broken centipede. At the end of the abyss, there is an extremely hidden transmission formation. When I was recovering my vitality in the abyss of broken centipede, I accidentally found this transmission formation, Xiao He said in a deep voice. Zhuowen nodded. Just as he was about to go deep into the abyss of broken centipede, a chill suddenly rose from his body. At the same time, a strand of sword qi appeared several meters behind Zhuowen. It emitted a terrifying sharpness as it shot toward Zhuowen's vital point from the back. This sword qi was extremely fast. In less than a blink of an eye, the sword qi, which was several feet away, had already landed on Zhuowen's back. Zhuowen's pupils shrank to the size of needles, but his reaction was not slow. He immediately took out the inferior immortal artifact, the iron folding fan, which he obtained from Jiang Binhan, and placed it horizontally behind him. At the same time, the underworld water droplets covered his back in layers. Clang. The sword qi, like a shuttle, pressed against the iron folding fan. Immediately after a loud clang, cracks appeared on the iron folding fan. The cracks grew bigger and bigger, and finally, the iron folding fan collapsed into nothingness. The sword qi, unharmed, continued to sweep towards Jun. Bang, 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 bang. The underworld water droplets began to explode continuously. In just one breath's time, all 3,000 underworld water droplets had collapsed into nothingness. The sense of crisis in Zhuowen's heart rose to the extreme. Then he suddenly retreated, combining the thunder wings, explosive steps, and the void, and directly teleported thousands of miles away. However, this sword qi was like a maggot in one's bones, chasing after Jun. Even though Zhuowen's speed had reached the point where he could teleport thousands of miles away, he still could not get rid of this sword qi. No matter where he fled, the sword qi would follow. Moreover, Jun could clearly feel the strong sense of crisis from this sword qi. Jun knew very well that if this sword qi really caught up with him, he was afraid that he would be in danger. What's going on? Is there someone else in the abyss of broken centipede? At this moment, Zhuowen's face was very unsightly. He originally thought that he had nothing to worry about after getting rid of Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei, but he did not expect that this sword qi would burst out all of a sudden. Zhuowen knew very well that this sword qi did not appear out of nowhere. Someone must have released it. Moreover, the person who released this sword qi had terrifying strength, perhaps even more terrifying than Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei. Immortal art, Lone Peak. Zhuowen clenched his teeth, took out another 1,000 immortal crystals, and used the Lone Peak. The 1,000-feet Lone Peak appeared once again, piercing through the clouds with incomparable arrogance. Unfortunately, although the 1,000-feet Lone Peak was powerful, it could only block the sword qi for less than a breath's time before collapsing. Damn it! How can this sword qi be so terrifying? Zhuowen's face turned purple. Then he took out more immortal crystals. This time, he took out 5,000 immortal crystals. The immortal core power produced by 5,000 immortal crystals was terrifying. It had reached the limit of what Zhuowen could bear, and was also the limit of the Lone Peak's power that he could use. In an instant, he crushed 5,000 immortal crystals. Zhuowen took a deep breath, absorbing all the immortal core power produced by the 5,000 immortal crystals into his body. Then he used the Lone Peak again. This time, the Lone Peak that appeared was 5,000 feet tall, and its power was much stronger than before. The Lone Peak stood in front of the sword qi. Soon after, the two collided, causing a violent tremor and then a violent explosion. Violent ripples appeared in the surrounding space, like a monstrous tsunami in the sea. Zhuowen let out a muffled groan as a trace of blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. The 5,000 feet lone peak collapsed with a loud bang, and the sword chi also dissipated with the collapse of the lone peak. Zhuan barely stabilized the boiling chi and blood in his body. The coldness in his eyes intensified as he said in a deep voice, Who is it? Bush. However, what answered Zhuan was 3 whistling sounds. Then, with a gloomy look, Yuan saw 3 extremely sharp sword chis in the void in front of him. None of the 3 strands of sword chi were much weaker than the previous one. Behind the 3 strands of sword chi, the space there began to twist violently. A slender figure with a ghost mask and a sword on his back followed closely behind the 3 strands of sword chi as he stood on a strand of sword chi. Looking at the 3 sword chis and the man behind the sword chis, Zhuan's pupils contracted. He cursed inwardly and immediately fled toward the shattered centipede abyss. Zhuan cursed inwardly. He did not expect that the man with the ghost mask would enter the shattered centipede abyss. This was beyond his expectations. However, this time, Zhuan found that the attack method of the man with the ghost mask was somewhat different from the one who framed him and Lei Tingqin. The 2 were probably not the same person. However, Zhuan had no time to care about this. The pressure from the man with the ghost mask was too great, forcing him to flee desperately. Just 1 sword chi was enough to put him in such a difficult situation. Zhuan knew very well that as the owner of the sword chi, the man with the ghost mask was definitely not someone he could contend against. The man with the ghost mask stepped on the sword chi. His gaze fell on Zhuan's back with a trace of confusion, but more than that, there was a chill. The 2 people, one chasing and one fleeing, were extremely fast, crossing fragment after fragment of the continent. The speed of the man with the ghost mask was very fast, a little faster than Zhuan. However, every time the man with the ghost mask was about to catch up to Zhuan, Zhuan would use the devouring curse forbidden technique to sweep to a fragment of the continent and use the restriction inside to block the man with the ghost mask. Because the man with the ghost mask was chasing too closely, Zhuan had no time to break the more powerful restriction of the fragment. Only the simple restriction could be easily broken by Zhuan in an instant. Although the simple restriction was not powerful, when there were many of them, it slowed down the speed of the man with the ghost mask a lot. This was also the reason why the man with the ghost mask was faster than Zhuan but could not catch up to Zhuan. Moreover, there were many fragments of the shattered centipede abyss. There were many restrictions inside, which provided a lot of convenience for Zhuan. The 2 people chased for 3 days. The man with the ghost mask faintly felt a trace of irritation. With a jerk of his right hand, he drew out the long sword on his back and slashed it across the sky. Instantly, a ray of sword chi shot out like a rainbow piercing through the sun. As soon as the sword chi appeared, the 3 original sword chis whistled and immediately integrated into the sword chi, causing the sword chi to become even more fierce. Its speed was also extremely fast, directly catching up with Zhuan. Zhuan's pupils shrank. Without thinking, he directly took out the Azure Dragon Palace. The sword chi of the man with the ghost mask was really too terrifying. It was as if this sword chi could shatter the world. Zhuan knew that with his current strength and other trump cards, they were useless under this sword chi, so he directly took out the Azure Dragon Palace. Bang! The sword chi slashed the Azure Dragon Palace, causing the vast Azure Dragon Palace to tremble violently. At this moment, the Azure Dragon Palace was like a lonely boat in the sea, constantly shaking. It looked really terrifying. Chapter 1697. Cutting the Heavens, eh? The man with the ghost face mask let out a cry of surprise. His right foot stepped on the air, and his entire body shot out like a shuttle, continuing to chase after Zhuan. Following that, the man with the ghost face mask slashed out powerful sword chi every time. However, Zhuan had the Azure Dragon Hall. Although the sword chi was strong, it was basically blocked by the Azure Dragon Hall. However, because the sword chi was too powerful, even though the Azure Dragon Hall was extremely tough and could not be destroyed by the sword chi, the aftershock from the collision between the sword chi and the Azure Dragon Hall still caused Zhuan to suffer quite a bit of injury. Moreover, as the sword chi swept over, the fluctuations of the Azure Dragon Hall became more and more intense. As time passed, the injuries in Zhuowen's body became more and more serious. In the end, he violently spat out a mouthful of blood. His face was as pale as snow, but his speed was not slow. He was like a rainbow cutting through the void. In the blink of an eye, 3 days and 3 nights had passed. Zhuowen's face was completely pale, and the injuries in his body were very serious. If it were not for the immortal pills and the yellow spring water droplets, one would not have been able to hold on for so long. Don't tell me that I have to hide in the Azure Dragon Hall like this? Zhuowen's expression was somewhat ugly. The man with the ghost face mask was simply too powerful. Although the Azure Dragon Hall was incomparably tough and could block the terrifying sword chi time and time again, the aftershock from the sword chi caused Zhuowen's injuries to worsen. His face was pale. At this moment, Yuan had no choice but to consider whether he should hide in the Azure Dragon Hall. After all, the Azure Dragon Hall was extraordinary. If Yuan hid inside, the man with the ghost face mask would not be able to do anything to him. However, once he hid in the Azure Dragon Hall, Yuan would appear to be in a very passive position. No one knew if the man with the ghost face mask had any other method to take away the Azure Dragon Hall. If the man with the ghost face mask really had such a method, when he brought the Azure Dragon Hall back to his headquarters where experts were as common as clouds, wouldn't Yuan be walking right into a trap? We're about to enter the deepest part of the shattered nightmare abyss. The teleportation array isn't far away. Brat, hold on a little longer. Suddenly, Xiao Hei's voice rang out in Zhuowen's mind, causing Zhuowen's eyes to narrow slightly. A sliver of hope appeared in his eyes as he increased his speed. Thousands of miles away, there were 4 fragments floating in the air. The 4 fragments were located in 4 different directions. Moreover, these 4 continents were connected by thick black iron chains. In the center of the 4 continents, there was a huge whirlpool. This whirlpool was 7-colored, and the center of the whirlpool was dark black. The whirlpool was at least several thousand feet wide, and there were 4 slender whirlpool streams on the 4 sides of the whirlpool. They spread to the 4 continents and formed 4 small whirlpools of 1,000 feet in the center of the 4 continents. Zhuan stared at the huge 7-colored whirlpool at the very center of the 4 continents in surprise. Each of the 4 continents was dozens of times larger than the one that had been destroyed by Zhuowen's seal. They were like colossi. Moreover, Zhuowen could sense that the restrictions on these 4 continents were far more complete and powerful than the huge fragment continent from before. Even if he had mastered the devouring curse restriction, he would probably have to be careful in these 4 continents. In particular, there was a huge 7-colored vortex at the center of the 4 continents. The presence it gave off made even Zhuowen tremble in fear. It was as if there was a powerful existence within the 7-colored vortex that Zhuowen could not resist. It made Zhuowen feel a deep sense of dread. This is the deepest part of the shattered nightmare abyss. The origins of the 4 continents and the 7-colored whirlpool are very mysterious. They did not exist when the shattered nightmare abyss was first created, but for some reason, the 7-colored whirlpool suddenly appeared and became the core of the shattered nightmare abyss, Xiao Hei explained. Even you don't know the origins of the 7-colored whirlpool? Zhuowen pondered. Soon after, he continued, where is the teleportation formation now? The man with the ghost mask is chasing us very closely. Xiao Hei waved her little claw and pointed at an inconspicuous fragment near the 4 continents. She said, the teleportation formation is very small and can only accommodate 2 people. It's placed on that fragment. Zhuowen followed Xiao Hei's gaze and immediately saw the fragment near the 4 continents. It was only several thousand feet in size. It was just too small compared to the 4 continents. If it were not for Xiao Hei's guidance, one would not have noticed this fragment at all. Let's go immediately. Zhuowen's eyes narrowed. Just as he was about to speed up, the man with the ghost mask behind him quickly slashed out dozens of times with his long sword. Immediately, streaks of sword light shot through the air like meteors and slammed into the Azure Dragon Hall. Boom boom boom. Continuous explosions immediately resounded. Subsequently, Zhuowen's expression changed drastically. He spat out a mouthful of blood and his footsteps suddenly came to a halt. You can't escape. The moment Zhuowen's figure paused, the person with the ghost face mask raised his long sword to the sky. Immediately, a huge sword chi whirlpool appeared in the sky. This sword chi whirlpool was like a shuttle as it suddenly rushed out. In an instant, it landed in front of the Azure Dragon Hall and blocked Zhuo Wen's path. Damn it! Zhuo Wen's face was pale. His right foot stepped on the void and he suddenly retreated. At the same time, the man with the ghost mask swept over from the void. His long sword was like a venomous snake as it suddenly swept out and went straight for Zhuo Wen's back. Zhuo Wen's gaze was extremely gloomy. He formed a seal with his right hand and the Azure Dragon Hall suddenly expanded by several thousand feet. Then, Zhuo Wen immediately entered the Azure Dragon Hall. Ding ding ding! The moment Zhuo Wen entered the Azure Dragon Hall, the man with the ghost mask suddenly pressed the long sword on his back against the Azure Dragon Hall. At the same time, the sword chi whirlpool in front of the Azure Dragon Hall approached the surface of the Azure Dragon Hall and erupted with countless sparks. The Azure Dragon Hall trembled violently, but it was not penetrated by the powerful sword chi. It was still intact. The man with the ghost mask frowned slightly. The long sword in his right hand repeatedly struck the surface of the Azure Dragon Hall. Clanging sounds erupted, but he was unable to break the Azure Dragon Hall. Brr! Suddenly, a terrifying aura erupted from the surface of the Azure Dragon Hall. Then, the shadow of a huge pale dragon swept out from the surface of the Azure Dragon Hall. With supreme power, it blasted toward the man with the ghost mask. The man with the grimace mask snorted coldly and bent his right wrist. Suddenly, the long sword in his hand moved like a shuttle and turned into a sword light. These sword lights gathered together and finally formed a huge sword. Then, it suddenly slashed down from the sky. Bang bang bang! A series of sounds rang out. The face of the man with the ghost mask changed slightly. Then he retreated step by step. He retreated hundreds of meters before he finally stopped. His eyes were full of solemnity. The Azure Dragon Hall also took advantage of the moment when the man with the ghost mask retreated to rush out and directly rushed toward the inconspicuous fragment. The man with the ghost mask slowly narrowed his eyes. His gaze also fell on the fragment. With his sharp eyes, he naturally saw that Zhuo Wen had repeatedly gone to the inconspicuous fragment. Although he was somewhat puzzled, he naturally would not let Zhuo Wen escape so easily. Immortal technique heaven slashing. The man with the ghost mask whispered softly. Holding the long sword in his right hand, his sword finger moved from the tip of the sword to the hilt of the sword. Suddenly, the long sword's blade erupted with a terrifying milky white light. Then, the masked man slashed out with his sword. Instantly, the dense milky white light on the blade separated from it. Then, the milky white light on the blade converged into a 30,000-meter long sword chi in the void. This sword chi was huge and shaped like a crescent moon. It was extremely fast. In an instant, it swept in front of the Azure Dragon Hall and slashed fiercely. Suddenly, the void in front of the Azure Dragon Hall collapsed into nothingness, forming a terrifying black hole. Countless black winds swept out from the black hole and stopped the Azure Dragon Hall that was flying over. At the same time, the huge sword chi swept high into the sky and ruthlessly slashed the top of the Azure Dragon Hall. Immediately, a terrifying rumbling sound erupted. In the Azure Dragon Square in the Azure Dragon Hall, Zhuo Wen's face was slightly pale. The man with the ghost mask was too strong. The immortal technique heaven slashing had actually caused the entire Azure Dragon Hall to shake so violently. This slash was enough to shatter any earthly immortal sacred artifact. If the sacred artifact of the Azure Dragon Hall was not of high quality and tough enough, it would probably have collapsed under this huge sword chi. Even so, the Azure Dragon Hall was like an overturned river at this moment. It was constantly shaking, and the shaking was so intense that it had already affected Zhuo Wen in the Azure Dragon Square. Your intention just now was too obvious. I'm afraid the man with the ghost mask is determined to stop you from going to that fragment. Xiao He sighed. Zhuo Wen's eyes revealed a hint of ruthlessness. He said, "In that case, I'll enter the 4 continents of the core area. I can feel that the restrictions in those 4 continents are extremely powerful. I cultivate the devouring curse forbidden. I don't believe that the ghost mask also grasps ancient restrictions. As he spoke, Zhuowen suddenly used the 1,000-kilogram fall to control the Azure Dragon Hall and flew towards the other 4 continents. The heaven-slashing sword Qi followed closely behind the Azure Dragon Hall like maggots. As for the man with the ghost mask, he chased after him while stepping on the sword Qi. Soon, the Azure Dragon Hall landed on the fragment in the east. The door of the hall opened, and Zhuowen quickly put away the Azure Dragon Hall. He immediately spread his thunder wings, erupted with the laws of space and explosive steps, and rushed out like an arrow leaving the bow. His eyes were filled with runes. At this moment, he was using the devouring curse forbidden to the best of his ability to search for the restrictions in this fragment. Got it. Soon, Zhuowen found the nearest restriction. It was a small hill, and at the top of the hill stood a tombstone. The restriction in front of him was not very powerful, so Zhuowen did not spend too much time. Chapter 1698. Eyeball. The moment the restriction on the tombstone was undone, Zhuowen immediately entered the tombstone restriction and disappeared from where he stood. At this moment, the masked man stepped into the tombstone. Just as he was about to chase after Zhuowen, the tombstone under the tombstone suddenly split open. A huge hand reached out from the tombstone and grabbed the masked man's feet. A restriction? The man with the ghost face mask did not panic. His eyes emitted a sword will that soared to the heavens. The giant hand that was grabbing his feet completely collapsed under his gaze that was filled with sword will. However, Zhuowen was delayed by the huge hand for a moment. He managed to pull away from the masked man. These are just small tricks. You still can't escape. The man with the devil mask smiled coldly. He stepped on the void with his right foot and his entire body turned into a sword. He broke through the layers of the void and swept toward Zhuowen in an instant. The distance between the two of them was immediately shortened. Zhuowen's gaze grew colder. As he fled, he used the devouring curse restriction to continuously use the restrictions on the road to obstruct the masked man. However, it was a pity that the masked man was too strong. Not a single restriction was able to trap the masked man. The restriction was only able to make the masked man's figure pause for a moment. Cold sweat started to flow incessantly from Zhuowen's forehead while his gaze was filled with gloominess. He originally thought that the restrictions here would be able to stop the masked man, yet he noticed that it was all in vain. Just like this, the two of them chased and fled again. They quickly approached the 7-colored vortex in the center of the continent. Behind the 7-colored vortex, a round eyeball could be vaguely seen. This eyeball was similar to an ordinary person's eye. The pupil was pitch black and 90% of the eye was white. Through the gaps of the 7-colored vortex, the eyeball suddenly noticed Zhuowen, who was constantly fleeing. Its pupils shrank in an extremely human-like manner. It actually showed a rare trace of dependence and doubt. At this moment, Zhuowen was only 100 meters away from the 7-colored vortex. He could even feel that the surrounding space was faintly distorted. This distorted space was caused by the 7-colored vortex. In this distorted space, Zhuowen's speed suddenly slowed down. However, the masked man chasing behind him was not affected at all. Soon, the masked man quickly caught up to Zhuowen. He bent his right wrist and the long sword flashed with a dazzling cold light in the air. It slashed toward Zhuowen's waist. A chill suddenly rushed from Zhuowen's feet to the top of Zhuowen's head, causing Zhuowen to involuntarily tremble. Zhuowen gritted his teeth and summoned the Green Dragon Palace again. It was like a huge mountain. The masked man's eyes exploded with coldness. The long sword in his right hand sped up and instantly cut through the void. He said coldly, "Immortal technique heaven slashing." The sword cut through the void and once again slashed out a sky-breaking sword Qi. It hit the surface of the Green Dragon Palace. Then, Zhuowen groaned. His right hand pressed against the surface of the Green Dragon Palace. He retreated continuously until he stopped more than 10 meters away from the 7-colored vortex. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Ding ding ding. The man with the ghost face mask took advantage of the opportunity to pursue and attack. He took a step forward and slashed out 3 times in a row. The 3 sword lights swept over and bombarded the top of the Azure Dragon Hall. It actually separated the Azure Dragon Hall, and the man with the ghost face mask took advantage of the gap when the Azure Dragon Hall was separated to stab with his sword, aiming for Zhuo Wen's vital point. The tip of the sword emitted a powerful milky white sword light. Zhuo Wen's pupils constricted as he stared at the incoming sword light. He wanted to retreat, but the sword light's powerful qi locked onto him, leaving him no time to dodge. Yun summoned the 1st and 9th Yangdao swords. At the same time, he used the devouring curse to its limit. However, all of his actions were useless against the powerful sword light. Almost all of his attacks were blocked by the sword light. He was unable to stop the powerful sword light. At that moment, Yun felt an unprecedented sense of danger. The shadow of death completely enveloped him. Yun, leave this to me and the fox. This person is too strong. Only the 2 of us can take action. Xiao He sighed gently in his sea of consciousness. Origin energy began to boil within him while Cheng Huang held the Fushi cauldron. He was ready to attack as well. The 2 of them could sense that Zhuan was in danger. If they did not take action, Zhuan might die. Once Zhuan died, the 2 of them would be finished as well. As a result, they were forced to take action. Even if they had to exhaust their origin energy, they had to protect Zhuan. However, just as Xiao He and Cheng Huang were about to take action, a sharp black bolt of lightning suddenly shot over. It shot out from behind Zhuan and slammed into the sword light. Crackle, crackle. The moment the black bolt of lightning struck the sword light, countless strands of black lightning rapidly spread across the entire sword light. Afterwards, the sword light directly dispersed under the entanglement of the strands of lightning. The moment the sword light dispersed, the masked man's eyes narrowed to the size of needles. He stared fixedly at the black bolt of lightning. His originally calm eyes finally revealed an intense change. The black bolt of lightning was extremely sharp. After devouring the sword light, it was completely unharmed. It directly shot towards the masked man, causing the air to crackle as it passed by. The masked man hurriedly retreated. He wielded his sword in his right hand and swung it again and again. Strands of sword light gathered into a huge crescent-shaped sword light that instantly slammed into the black bolt of lightning. Rumble! The sword light erupted with dazzling light the moment it collided with the black bolt of lightning. It actually managed to block the bolt of lightning. However, the sword light did not last for very long before it collapsed. The black bolt of lightning shot out once more. It was like a specter in the night. Although it seemed slightly dim, it was still as sharp as before. The masked man's eyes were filled with graveness. He retreated once more, retreating several tens of thousands of meters away. He wielded his sword in his right hand as he formed a seal with his left hand and suddenly pressed it against the blade. Immortal technique, chaotic sword cutting the sky. As he spoke, the masked man quickly swung his sword 9 times. 9 strands of sword chi descended from the void in a chaotic manner and crashed into the black bolt of lightning. Bang, 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 bang. 9 strands of sword chi superimposed on one another. Their power actually underwent a qualitative change. When they collided with the black bolt of lightning, countless continuous roars resounded, causing the entire fragment to quake. The space within a few thousand meters suddenly turned into a black hole. Looking at this scene, Zhuowen's eyes were filled with shock. At the same time, he was extremely puzzled. Where did the black bolt of lightning come from? Moreover, it seemed that the black bolt of lightning was helping him. Thinking of this, Zhuan could not help but turn around. Then his eyes were fixed on the colorful vortex. In the colorful vortex, he saw a round eyeball looking at Zhuan with confusion and attachment. This made Zhuan involuntarily take a few steps back. What is this? Zhuan whispered with a grave look. Bang, bang, bang. Suddenly, the whole fragment shook even more violently. Even Zhuan staggered a little. The fierce black bolt of lightning was finally annihilated under the bombardment of the 9 strands of sword chi. The masked man, on the other hand, was filled with a murderous aura. He rushed out from the dust with a long sword in his hand and his hair dancing in the wind. Zhuan's eyes turned cold. The moment he was about to take a defensive posture, The eyeball behind him showed a trace of displeasure. Immediately, 3 black bolts of lightning flashed out of the eyeball's pupil. These 3 black bolts of lightning were exactly the same as the previous one. The aura they revealed was not much weaker than the previous one. The black bolt of lightning was released by this eyeball? Zhuan could not help but exclaim in surprise. He stared at the eyeball behind him with bright eyes. Chapter 1699. Immortal Qi, what a rich energy this is. The moment Zhuan entered the 7-colored vortex, he felt an extremely rich energy rush towards him. He only took a small breath and felt his whole body become refreshed and warm. Pissed, pissed, pissed. The eyeball instantly arrived in front of Zhuan. It looked around and finally fell on Zhuan, as if it was trying to tell Zhuan something. Zhuan looked around and found that the surroundings were filled with milky white light. The inside of the light was oval, as if Zhuan was inside a round egg. Moreover, the inside was filled with milky white gas. This gas was extremely rich and had turned into a white fog, making it difficult for people to see the specific environment and scenery around them. Zhuan gradually breathed in the milky white gas around him, and a hint of joy appeared in his eyes. The energy contained in this milky white gas was extremely mysterious. As soon as it entered his body, it flowed through his meridians and into his dantian, forming a powerful saint energy. Moreover, the saint energy formed by this milky white gas gathering in his dantian was much stronger and more resilient than ordinary saint energy. Moreover, from the eyeball's actions just now, Zhuan could vaguely guess that this eyeball wanted him to absorb the milky white gas inside. This is immortal Qi. I didn't expect that this 7-colored vortex actually contains immortal Qi. Xiao He couldn't help but exclaim in his sea of consciousness. Her expression was full of excitement. Immortal Qi? Zhuan narrowed his eyes and asked doubtfully. Xiao He was still in a state of excitement. After calming down with great difficulty, she slowly explained the immortal Qi to Zhuan. In ancient times, the reason why martial arts were so prosperous was actually inseparable from this immortal Qi. In that era, what existed in the air was not the current Yuan Qi, but this so-called immortal Qi. This immortal Qi was many times more advanced than Yuan Qi. It was precisely because of the existence of immortal Qi that there were so many capable people in ancient times. There were even deities. In that era, the limitations of immortal techniques were not so great. Even profound sages and heavenly sages could rely on immortal Qi to perform immortal techniques. That era was the best era for martial artists. However, after the catastrophe, the continent was broken apart, and the immortal Qi degenerated into Yuan Qi. Because of this, martial arts had also degenerated for countless years. At this point, Xiao He, immortal Qi, even if your cultivation hasn't reached immortal sage realm, and immortal Qi, Xiao He, immortal Qi, even if your cultivation realm, immortal realm. Zhuowen's eyes narrowed when he heard that. He stared fixedly at the surrounding immortal Qi and said, "No wonder I felt warm and extremely comfortable after absorbing the immortal Qi in the surroundings. So this is immortal Qi from the ancient times." However, after the catastrophe, didn't the immortal Qi degenerate? Why is there still immortal Qi here? Moreover, the immortal Qi here is extremely rich. I'm afraid that such rich immortal Qi is extremely rare even in ancient times. Speaking of this, Zhuowen's eyes revealed a hint of doubt. Obviously, he did not understand why there was still immortal Qi here, and what was the origin of this eyeball. The black lightning that was spitting out from this eyeball was very powerful. It was actually able to force the person with the ghost mask to not dare to fight back at all. He directly turned around and fled. It was really shocking. All these doubts remained in Zhuowen's heart, causing him to ponder deeply and be puzzled. Finally, he looked at Xiao He. In his sea of consciousness, Xiao He spread out her hands and smiled bitterly. "You don't have to look at me. I don't know what's going on either. The battlefield I was in back then was only the tip of the iceberg. Coupled with the fact that my strength was limited, I was unable to come into contact with the battle at the highest level. It's useless for you to ask me. Zhuan sighed gently. He knew that Xiao He really did not know. It seemed that there were many mysteries surrounding the catastrophe back then. However, he also knew that as his strength continued to increase, the truth of the catastrophe would gradually come to light. Right now, what Zhuan needed was to continuously increase his strength. Only those who were powerful had the right to know the ancient secrets. Since there's immortal qi here, I might as well cultivate here. With that, Zhuan sat down with his legs crossed and began to use the immortal qi here to cultivate. When the eyeball that hovered nearby saw Zhuan sitting down to cultivate, its eyes were filled with joy. Just as Zhuan entered the seven-colored whirlpool to cultivate, the man with the ghost face mask slowly appeared in the void thousands of miles away from the fragment. At that moment, the man with the ghost face mask was in a rather sorry state. The 3 black lightning bolts were very powerful. If he had not escaped the fragment in time and the black lightning bolts could not leave the fragment, he would have been in imminent danger. The man with the ghost face mask's eyes flickered. In the end, he did not choose to leave. Instead, he chose a fragment near the 7-colored whirlpool and hollowed it out with a sword. Then, he sank into the depths of the fragment and began to wait silently. He knew that Zhuan could not stay in the 7-colored whirlpool forever. There would be a day when he would come out. The day when Zhuan came out, he would be able to completely capture Zhuan. After all, he had always followed orders. If he could not complete the mission, he would not return. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, 2 years had passed. In these 2 years, the Wind and Thunder clan and the Ice and Fire clan had kept a very low profile. However, even though the 2 great clans kept a very low profile, there were more and more rumors about Lei Qingtian and Jiang Zuomei disappearing in the Shattered Nightmare Abyss for 2 years. However, the most widespread rumor was that Lei Qingtian, the head of the Thunder branch of the Wind and Thunder clan, and Jiang Zuomei, the head of the Ice and Fire clan, had both died in the Shattered Nightmare Abyss with Zhuan. In the face of such rumors, the 2 clans maintained a rare silence and did not come forward to defend themselves. The silence of the 2 clans caused the rumors to spread even more widely and had a tendency to become more and more intense. On the other hand, Zhuan's name had thoroughly spread throughout the central region. Although everyone knew that Zhuan would most likely die in the Shattered Nightmare Abyss, it was absolutely worth it to have 2 earthly immortals accompany him to the grave. On this day, 2 figures stood quietly at the edge of the cliff of the Shattered Nightmare Abyss. The strange thing was that the 2 figures were rather strange. Although they stood at the edge of the cliff, their auras were faintly discernible. If one did not look carefully, they would be treated as air. One of them was a middle-aged man with long, flowing hair that fluttered in the wind. He gave off a free and unrestrained aura, while the other was an old man with white hair and a youthful complexion. He was dressed in an amber-white arcanist robe, and he seemed to be in high spirits. The 2 stood quietly like this. Finally, the old man spoke. "Divine Lord, that existence's head should be in the deepest part of the Shattered Nightmare Abyss. If I'm not wrong, that existence's body should have been dismembered and left in one of the 6 danger zones. The thing here is the head." The middle-aged man pondered for a moment and said in a deep voice, "I really didn't expect that such an existence would be dismembered. The person who was called the strongest person on the heavenly armor continent back then is indeed extraordinary. The strongest person is indeed extraordinary. After all, that person has been plotting for hundreds of thousands of years. Even if his cultivation is not as high as that existence's, his intelligence and scheming are the best in the world. Even that existence was tricked. The title of the strongest person is not baseless." The old man sighed softly. A rare look of admiration appeared in his eyes. Obviously, the old man was quite convinced of the so-called strongest person on the heavenly armor continent. Even if he was the strongest person, even if he had been plotting for hundreds of thousands of years, so what? In the end, he still couldn't break free from his shackles. In the face of absolute power, he still fell. However, the powerful existence he plotted against didn't die. It was just dismembered. The middle-aged man called the Divine Lord sneered and said arrogantly. The old man bowed slightly and didn't say much. However, his eyes revealed a trace of disapproval. "It's all in the past. Let's not talk about it. Now, let's enter the shattered nightmare abyss and explore. If we can really find that existence's head, then it will be much easier for us to gather the other parts. The old man shook his head. The middle-aged man nodded. Soon after, he lifted his right foot and an enormous force emanated from the bottom of his foot. This force was too terrifying. With a single step, the terrifying black wind at the bottom of the abyss was completely annihilated, revealing the bottomless abyss below. If someone were to witness this scene, they would definitely be shocked and their hearts would beat wildly. The terror of the black wind in the shattered nightmare abyss was well known in the central mainland. Even earthly immortals wouldn't dare to enter the black wind at will. However, this man only lifted his foot and took a step. Just like that, the black wind that plagued countless warriors in the central mainland was temporarily annihilated. Let's go! The middle-aged man's eyes were calm, as if he had just done a very ordinary thing. Immediately, he took a step and plunged directly into the depths of the shattered nightmare abyss. His speed was as fast as lightning. Wherever he passed, countless hissing sounds of the wind resounded. The old man pondered for a moment. With a wave of his sleeve, surging mind power lingered around his body. Immediately, he chased after the middle-aged man at an extremely fast speed. Not long after the two entered the shattered nightmare abyss, the black wind that had disappeared above the abyss gradually reappeared. It was dense and looked particularly terrifying. In the depths of the shattered nightmare abyss, in the space of the fragment continent to the east of the seven-colored vortex, Jun suddenly opened his eyes. His aura was growing stronger and stronger. Chapter 1700. Heaven-defying sacred realm. Over the past 2 years, immortal qi had been constantly nourishing Zhuowen's meridians and acupoints, allowing Zhuowen's cultivation to reach the peak of the sky sacred realm. Zhuowen's eyes flashed. Taking a deep breath, he opened his meridians and began to frantically absorb the immortal qi around him. Although he had been constantly absorbing immortal qi over the past 2 years, he had basically used it to temper himself instead of immediately absorbing immortal qi to raise his cultivation. He knew very well that he had just reached the sky sacred realm not long ago, so his foundation was not very stable. If he immediately absorbed immortal qi to raise his cultivation, not only would it not be beneficial to him, but it would also bring great hidden dangers. Therefore, over the past 2 years, Jun had been using immortal qi to temper his foundation. This was just like laying a foundation. As long as the foundation was deep enough, the building he built on it would be extremely stable and would not fall. Although 2 years was a short period of time, with immortal qi, which was a surging energy that far surpassed Yuan qi, the efficiency of polishing his foundation was much faster than usual. These 2 years were enough for him to completely stabilize his sky saint realm. This was also why Jun dared to break through to the sky sacred realm now and was not afraid of any hidden dangers. The immortal qi kept pouring into Zhuowen's acupoints, followed the countless meridians in Zhuowen's body, and rushed into his dantian. Zhuowen's aura also grew stronger as the immortal qi poured into his body. The moment his aura reached its peak, Jun was stunned and frowned slightly. With the influx of immortal qi, the moment he tried to break through the barrier of the heaven-defying saint stage, he actually felt an extremely strong resistance, preventing Zhuowen from taking the final step of the breakthrough. I've been accumulating immortal qi for 2 years, but I still can't break through to the heaven-defying sacred realm? Zhuowen sighed softly. He also knew that he had broken through too quickly. It was too unrealistic for him to directly jump from the early stage of the sky sacred realm to the heaven-defying sacred realm in 2 years. After all, ordinary Empyrean saint stage saints would need to accumulate for hundreds or thousands of years before attempting to break through to the heaven-defying saint stage. However, Zhuowen only needed 2 years. Although Zhuowen's progress was indeed fast with the help of the divine qi, 2 years was too short. If Jun accumulated the divine qi for more than 10 years, he might be able to smoothly break through to the heaven-defying saint realm. Just as Jun sighed and was about to withdraw the immortal qi that was entering his body, the eyeball that was floating not far away and had been watching Zhuowen all this time suddenly screeched and flew over. Instantly, all the immortal chi in the entire space gathered in the eyeball. In an instant, the space that was originally filled with immortal chi changed drastically. There was no longer any immortal chi in the surroundings, and the eyeball swept in front of Jun. Jun stared at the eyeball and suddenly realized that there was a 7-colored vortex in the pupil of the eyeball. Then, the 7-colored vortex suddenly swept out and floated above Zhuowen's Tianling acupoint. Clatter! The moment the 7-colored vortex floated above Zhuowen's Tianling acupoint, a huge amount of immortal qi condensed into a rotating column of qi and poured into Zhuowen's Tianling acupoint. In an instant, as the purer immortal qi poured into Zhuowen's body, the aura in Zhuowen's body surged and became much stronger. The strong resistance that had been preventing Zhuowen from breaking through to the heaven-defying Saint Realm showed signs of loosening under the infusion of the pure immortal qi. As time passed, an hour later, the immortal qi that gushed out of the 7-colored vortex underwent a qualitative change. In an instant, it became much larger and broke through the resistance of breaking through to the heaven-defying Saint Realm. Sizzle! 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 At this instant, Zhuowen's long hair and clothes fluttered even though there was no wind. Moreover, the bearing he emanated seemed completely different. And the aura on his body was many times stronger than before. The formless qi turned into ring-shaped ripples that filled the entire space, and an ear-piercing hissing sound rang out. It was as if the air was being torn apart at all times. I've reached the heaven-defying Saint Realm. Zhuowen's eyes could not hide his excitement, but soon his attention fell on the eyeball in front of him. He did not understand why the eyeball had helped him so many times. The person who had released the black lightning to help him drive away the grimace mask was now pouring all the immortal qi here into his body to help him smoothly break through to the heaven-defying Saint Realm. Perhaps it had noticed Zhuowen's gaze. The eyeball hissed and rushed to Jun. It rubbed the back of Zhuowen's hand intimately like a docile kitten. This eyeball is sticking to you, but its origin is unknown. Boy, what are you going to do with it? Xiaohei asked in a low voice. Zhuowen's eyes flashed. This eyeball has no malice towards me, and the black lightning on it is extremely powerful. Perhaps it will be of great help to me. I plan to take it with me. Xiaohei fell silent, and then said in a low voice, "This thing comes from the core of the shattered elephant abyss. Its origin is strange, and the 7-colored vortex is even more unpredictable. If you plan to take it with you, you have to be careful at all times." Zhuowen's face turned serious, and a thoughtful look appeared in his eyes. Then he nodded and said, "I will pay attention to this." With that, Zhuowen took out a crystal from his ribs and opened it, indicating for the eyeball to enter it. The eyeball, however, shook its eyeball like a human. Soon after, it burrowed into Zhuowen's clothes and rested comfortably in one of his pockets. Seeing that the eyeball was unwilling to enter the storage crystal, Zhuowen did not force it. He put away the storage crystal, patted the eyeball, and then looked at the entrance of the 7-colored vortex. Based on the character of the man with the ghost face mask, I'm afraid he will not give up. I'm afraid he is still waiting for me outside. But now that I have 2 earthly immortal realm primordial spirits and this eyeball, I may not be afraid of the man with the ghost face mask. Now is the best time to go out. With that, Zhuowen took a step forward and walked out of the 7-colored whirlpool. He landed on the eastern fragment. Walking out of the 7-colored vortex, Zhuowen's eyes quickly fell on the other 3 7-colored vortexes on the other 3 continents, as well as the huge 7-colored vortex surrounded by the other 4 continents. There is such rich divine qi in this 7-colored vortex. I wonder if the other 3 vortexes and the huge main vortex are the same? Zhuowen stared at the other 7-colored vortexes and murmured in a low voice. However, as soon as Zhuowen finished speaking, the eyeball lying in his arms suddenly hissed and floated in front of Zhuowen. The eyeball revealed a dignified and frightened look, and it shook its head like a human. Do you mean that I shouldn't enter the other 7-colored vortexes? Are there dangers in the other 7-colored vortexes? Zhuowen's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew that the eyeball was suddenly so nervous. He was afraid that the other 7-colored vortexes were dangerous places. The eyeball nodded its head in a very human-like manner, indicating that it agreed with Yun. Is that so? Zhuan frowned slightly and glanced at the other 7 colored vortexes. He always felt that there was something strange about this place. Moreover, the eyeball's behavior made him very puzzled. If it weren't for the fact that the eyeball had saved him and showed no hostility, Zhuan wouldn't have believed it. Just as Zhuan was pondering, the sound of something breaking through the air suddenly swept over. Immediately, the man with the ghost face mask rushed over, holding a long sword in his hand. Like an arrow leaving the bowstring, he rushed over in an instant. His speed was extremely fast, and in an instant he was dozens of meters in front of Zhuan. Zhuan slowly raised his head and stared at the man with the ghost face mask who was rushing over. A mocking smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. The moment the man with the ghost face mask rushed over, the eyeball suddenly crossed in front of Zhuan, and a fierce black lightning flashed out of its pitch-black pupil. The black lightning cut through the air and immediately arrived in front of the man with the ghost face mask with a rumbling sound. The moment he saw the black lightning, the man with the ghost face mask's pupils shrank to the size of needles. He hurriedly stopped his figure that was rushing over. He raised the sword in his right hand and swung it upwards. A terrifying sword chi soared into the sky and stood on top of the black lightning. Bang, bang, bang. Unfortunately, the moment the sword chi came into contact with the black lightning, it immediately emitted a series of crisp sounds. Then, the sword chi was completely swallowed up by the black lightning. The man with the ghost face mask stepped on the ground and retreated, wanting to avoid the black lightning. However, the moment he retreated, an incomparably huge hall suddenly appeared behind him and smashed down fiercely. The face of the man with the ghost face mask changed slightly. He swung his right hand and slashed out with his sword, blocking the Azure Dragon Palace. However, after being delayed by the Azure Dragon Palace, the black lightning immediately caught up. The man with the ghost face mask had no choice but to use the heaven-slashing chaotic sword again. However, this time, the 9 sword chis he sent out were no longer attacks. Instead, they surrounded his body and formed a layer of powerful sword chi defense. Pitter-patter. The sound of firecrackers rang out. Countless black electric threads, like innumerable small snakes, surrounded the 9 sword chis and constantly and slowly wore down the defense of the 9 sword chis. The killing intent in Zhuowen's eyes grew stronger. The man with the ghost face mask was extremely mysterious and had targeted him many times. If he let the man with the ghost face mask escape like this, Zhuowen was really unwilling. It seems that the only way to completely kill the man with the ghost face mask is to use the primordial spirit self-explosion. Zhuowen flicked his finger and took out a primordial spirit sealed by countless spells from the spirit ring. This primordial spirit was Lei Qingtian's primordial spirit. The primordial spirit self-explosion was Zhuowen's most powerful and terrifying trump card. Moreover, it was only a one-time use. After using it once, it could not be used again. Its power was very terrifying, but at the same time, it could not be used again. Therefore, Zhuowen did not intend to use it unless it was really a critical moment. However, Zhuowen did not want to let go of the man with the ghost face mask in front of him. Moreover, Zhuowen also wanted to find out who the man with the ghost face mask was. Therefore, he resolutely took out a primordial spirit. Zhuowen made a gesture with his right hand and suddenly touched the surface of the primordial spirit. Then, his right hand grabbed the primordial spirit and threw it towards the man with the ghost face mask. Chapter 1701. Primordial Spirit Explosion Whoosh. At this moment, the primordial spirit was like a bomb that could explode at any time. The aura that was brewing on its surface became more and more terrifying. When the primordial spirit arrived in front of the man with the ghost mask, its terrifying aura reached its peak. At this moment, the man with the ghost mask was holding a sword in his right hand. With the help of the 9 powerful sword chis, he was constantly offsetting the strange black lightning on the surface of the primordial spirit. When the black lightning was about to be annihilated by him, his expression changed greatly. He stared at the primordial spirit that was approaching him. A strong sense of crisis brewed in his mind. This sense of crisis was so strong that it made the man with the ghost mask's heart beat wildly. A strong sense of fear arose in his heart. Primordial spirit? Of an earthly immortal? The man with the ghost mask naturally saw the true face of the primordial spirit. The fear in his heart reached its peak. He screamed and retreated rapidly. He did not expect that Zhuan would take out the primordial spirit of an earthly immortal. Although he knew that Jiang Zuomei was killed by Zhuan and her primordial spirit was taken away, he never expected that this boy could control the primordial spirit to self-explode. Generally speaking, it was very difficult to control the primordial spirit to self-explode. Basically, it required the strength of an earthly immortal. However, this boy had not reached the earthly immortal level yet, but he could control the primordial spirit to self-explode. This was really incredible. The aura of the primordial spirit was getting stronger and stronger, revealing a terrifying sense of destruction. It was clearly a sign that it was about to explode. Retreat quickly. The man with the ghost mask retreated rapidly without hesitation. Unfortunately, Zhuan would not let him succeed. However, the moment the primordial spirit was within 100 meters of the man, Zhuan immediately detonated the primordial spirit with a thought. Boom, boom, boom. In an instant, the sound of continuous explosions resounded in the void. Then, clusters of extremely terrifying explosions came one after another and spread out, covering an area of hundreds of thousands of feet. Such a huge explosion caused Zhuan to continuously retreat until he was out of the range of the explosion. Only then did he look at the world-destroying explosion with shock in his eyes. I didn't expect that the explosion of the primordial spirit would produce such a terrifying force. This force should be enough to blast an earth immortal to death, right? Zhuan was deeply shocked by the power of the explosion. He knew very well that if he, Zhuan, was at the center of the explosion, he would definitely die. The power of the explosion was terrifying. The entire shattered nightmare abyss seemed to shake because of it, and the nearest rainbow vortex and 4 continents were also enveloped by the explosion. However, what made Zhuan cautious was that the 7-colored vortex was like an incomparably hard iron stone. It radiated outwards and enveloped the 4 continents. The instant the explosion spread over, it did not move at all, and was not affected by the explosion at all. The explosion lasted for half an incense stick of time. Finally, it slowly disappeared. Soon after, it revealed the mess within 100,000 feet in front of them. Apart from the 4 continents enveloped by the 7-colored vortex, all the fragments within the range of a few 100,000 meters had been shattered into pieces. However, before the explosion, Nguyen had already stored the fragment with the transmission array in the Azure Dragon Palace and the Spirit Ring space in advance. Zhuowen looked over and immediately noticed that not far away from the explosion, there was an enormous sword-shaped phantom that was a few 100 meters in size quietly floating in the air. In the shadow of the sword, the man with the ghost mask was curled up with a pale face. At this moment, the surface of the shadow of the sword began to be filled with countless cracks, and the cracks grew more and more. In the end, it collapsed with a loud bang. The man with the ghost mask who was curled up inside suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. His face was extremely pale, and the long sword in his hand also collapsed into nothingness. The man with the ghost mask stared at Zhuan. He wanted to speak, but he spat out another mouthful of blood and directly fainted. Zhuan instantly rushed to the front of the man with the ghost mask. The eyeball followed closely beside him. At the same time, Zhuan set up powerful defensive measures around his body, just in case. Zhuowen formed a seal with his right hand, and sharp spikes grew out of the fingertips formed by the slaughtering finger of the netherworld. He suddenly and silently stabbed at the neck of the man with the devil mask. However, the moment the slaughtering finger was about to penetrate the neck of the man with the ghost mask, Zhuan narrowed his eyes and stopped the movement of his right finger. Forget it, let's see who this person is first. It won't be too late to kill him later. Zhuowen's eyes flickered. He slowly withdrew the slaughtering finger, stretched out his right hand, and lifted the ghost mask on the man's face. A pale and rather handsome young man's face suddenly appeared in front of Zhuan. The man's eyes were closed, and cold sweat was dripping down his forehead, as if he was having a nightmare. When Zhuowen's eyes fell on the man's face, He could not help but be stunned. His pupils shrank to the size of needles, and he gasped and said, "It's him? How is it possible? How can he advance so quickly? It's only been a little more than 10 years. At this moment, Zhuowen's eyes were full of confusion, doubt, and inexplicable shock. Let's go. I feel two extremely powerful auras approaching quickly. These two auras are very terrifying, far surpassing that of an earthly immortal. If we are discovered by these two people, you and I won't be able to leave." Suddenly, Xiao He in the sea of consciousness exclaimed, her voice full of shock. Zhuowen was startled. He hadn't noticed the two powerful auras at all. However, he knew that Xiao He's divine sense was much stronger than his divine sense. Xiao He was usually able to sense things that were further away than him. "Let's go." Zhuowen didn't waste any time. With a wave of his sleeve, the devouring curse seal continuously shot out and immediately sealed the person with the ghost mask. After putting the ghost mask into the Azure Dragon Hall, Zhuowen took out the fragment with the teleportation array in the hall. After entering the fragment, Zhuowen quickly found the transmission formation hidden in the deepest part of the fragment under the guidance of Xiao He. Without thinking, he activated the devouring curse without hesitation. At this moment, in the void hundreds of thousands of miles away, the middle-aged man and the old man were slowly shuttling through countless fragments. There's a big commotion in the Broken Fang Abyss. There seems to be a great battle in the deepest part of the Broken Fang Abyss. Let's hurry over and take a look. The middle-aged man narrowed his eyes and took a step forward. The space in front of him suddenly distorted, and he disappeared along with the distortion. The movement technique used by the middle-aged man at this moment was extraordinary. It was much faster than the teleportation of an earthly immortal. If anyone saw the middle-aged man's movement technique, they would definitely cry out in surprise. This was because the movement technique used by the middle-aged man was not teleportation, but teleportation above teleportation. The speed of this teleportation was many times faster than teleportation. Teleportation allowed one to travel to any location within 10,000 miles in an instant. Teleportation above teleportation allowed one to travel 100,000 miles in an instant. Its speed was 10 times faster than teleportation. As for those who were able to teleport, only those whose cultivation base was at the heavenly immortal realm and above could master it. The old man looked at the middle-aged man who had teleported away with a touch of envy in his eyes. He said, "There are so many benefits to being a celestial saint realm expert. This old man is really envious of the ability to teleport and teleport." Having said that, the old man waved his sleeve. Immediately, a sparkling and translucent crystal floated above the old man's palm. Then the old man squeezed it. Immediately, endless energy gushed out from the crystal and formed an invisible vortex. The old man took a step forward and immediately entered the vortex, disappearing on the spot. In just a few breaths' time, the middle-aged man and the old man both arrived at the core of the shattered nightmare abyss. Their gazes first fell on the seven-colored vortex, and the corners of their mouths curled up. However, their gazes soon fell on Zhuowen, who was in the debris not far away. At this moment, Zhuowen had already activated the teleportation array. Perhaps sensing something, he immediately turned his head to look in the direction of the middle-aged man and the old man. The moment his gaze fell on them, it was as if countless bombs had exploded in his mind. The noise was so loud that Zhuowen's ears buzzed. He couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood, which was filled with the smell of blood. This is too terrifying. Who are these two people? At this moment, Zhuowen's heart was beating wildly. Without thinking, he immediately lifted his right foot and stepped into the array. However, the moment he stepped into the array, the middle-aged man's eyes narrowed. An extremely powerful white light burst out from his eyes. With just one look, endless majesty and pressure erupted. It was as if countless mountains were crushing down on Zhuowen's body. Zhuowen's body stiffened and he couldn't move. This person is too terrifying. He froze me in place with just one look. Zhuowen groaned inwardly. He didn't expect that two such terrifying experts would suddenly appear in the shattered nightmare abyss. His heart was filled with bitterness. The middle-aged man looked down at Zhuowen indifferently and said, "It's really strange that a little guy of the heaven-defying saint stage can still survive in the shattered nightmare abyss." The old man next to him opened and closed his nose. His eyes flashing, he said, "If I'm not mistaken, the explosion just now was the self-destruction of the primordial spirit of an earth immortal." How strange. Why would an earth immortal be willing to self-destruct? Self-destruction of an earth immortal? The middle-aged man looked surprised. Apparently, he was also surprised by the self-destruction of an earth immortal. After all, those who could cultivate to the earth immortal realm were basically brilliant people who had experienced countless years of cultivation to reach the level of an earth immortal. If it wasn't a moment of life and death, an earth immortal wouldn't risk his primordial spirit not to self-destruct. After all, after the primordial spirit self-destructed, it wouldn't enter the reincarnation cycle and would completely disappear from the world. The price to pay was great. But now, the earth immortal had self-destructed. There was no doubt that someone had forced the earth immortal into a moment of life and death. Chapter 1702. Myriad Elephant Ceiling Formation. Zhuowen's forehead was covered in cold sweat. The pressure from the sudden appearance of the middle-aged man and the old man was far too great. The pressure far exceeded that of Lei Qingtian, Jiang Zuomei, and the man with the devil mask. Even Feng Lei Wuji and Jiang Binghan were slightly weaker than the two of them. Just what kind of existences are these two? They're actually exerting such a terrifying pressure on me. Zhuowen knew the situation was bad. Although he wanted to struggle with all his might, he sadly discovered that he couldn't move at all. The middle-aged man's gaze was like the might of heaven, firmly suppressing him. What Zhuowen didn't notice was that the eyeball in his arms was like a dead fish the moment the middle-aged man and the old man appeared. It lay motionless in Zhuowen's arms, and even its aura had completely vanished. The middle-aged man and the old man's attention clearly wasn't completely focused on Zhuowen. They only casually glanced at Zhuowen before looking at the core of the rainbow vortex. That existence's head should be stored in this rainbow vortex. This rainbow vortex should be a seal laid down by the strongest person on the heavenly armor continent, Songjie. This seal isn't simple, the middle-aged man said indifferently. As soon as the middle-aged man said that, Zhuowen, who was standing in front of the teleportation formation, noticed that Xiao He in his sea of consciousness trembled as if she had heard something extremely shocking. Zhuowen was surprised. He couldn't help but ask Xiao He, what's wrong? Xiao He hovered in the air in his sea of consciousness. Her gaze was filled with complicated emotions, while Cheng Huang's carefree expression had vanished. It was replaced with an extremely solemn expression. Xiao He fell silent for a while. In the end, she sighed softly and said, "Nothing. I was just distracted for a moment." Cheng Huang, who hovered beside Xiao He, originally wanted to say something, but a glare from Xiao He silenced him. Zhuowen naturally noticed Xiao He and Cheng Huang's expressions. He originally wanted to continue asking, but Xiao He interrupted him. "Kid, you still have the time to think about such unimportant things? You should be thinking about how to break free from the suppression on you right now." Zhuowen smiled bitterly when he heard that. This person is too strong. Just the might contained in a single glance is enough to make me tremble. I'm unable to move. How am I supposed to break free? Xiao He and Cheng Huang exchanged glances. Xiao He and Cheng Huang. Xiao He and Cheng Huang's glare. Xiao He and Cheng Huang looked. Huang and Huang are, Xiao He and Huang were. Hey studio Cheng and Huang glare Chen where was studio in? In was studio where was. Once you break free from the suppression, immediately leave through the teleportation formation. Don't hesitate at all. Zhuowen nodded solemnly. He raised his head to look at the middle-aged man and old man. Sure enough, he noticed that the middle-aged man and old man did not pay any attention to him. Or perhaps, they had completely ignored Zhuowen. "If we work together, we might be able to break free from the seal," said the old man. The middle-aged man nodded and said, "However, I hope Elder Gu can set up the myriad sealing grand formation before we break open the seal. That way, We can prevent the existence sealed within from seizing the opportunity to escape once the seal is broken open. Elder Gu nodded and said, "You're right, Divine Master. I'll begin setting up the universal sealing formation right now." As he spoke, Elder Gu leaped up and instantly arrived above the seven-colored vortex. He slowly extended his emaciated right hand and suddenly pulled. Immediately, terrifying mental energy surged out. This mental energy was extremely powerful. It was like a boundless sea whistling over. Elder Gu's hands pointed at the void and suddenly formed a seal. Instantly, the spiritual sea turned into an invisible restriction. The range of the restriction was extremely large. It actually enveloped the seven-colored vortex and the four fragments. It was an extremely large area. Elder Gu's mental energy was able to envelop such a large area with it. Just how powerful was his mental energy? Although Zhuan had just become a profound Saint Master and cultivated the myriad evolution scripture, his mental energy was extremely powerful. However, he could only radiate less than a quarter of the area of the four fragments. The difference between him and the old man was like heaven and earth. "He's the Saint Master?" Zhuan stared at Elder Gu. His body trembled. It was as if thousands of bolts of lightning were exploding in his mind, causing Zhuan's mind to go blank. "Chen Shui," Zhuan muttered in a low voice. His eyes suddenly shone with an unprecedented light. Back then, Xiao He had said that it was possible for a Saint Master to completely awaken Mu Chen Xue, and this old man before him was a ready-made Saint Master. Zhuan knew that this was an opportunity. He's actually a Saint Master. In other words, these two people are from the Primal Chaos Temple? Xiao He's gaze passed through the heavy fog and finally landed on Elder Gu and the middle-aged man. Her eyes were filled with deep thought. At this moment, after Elder Gu set up the last restriction, he suddenly waved his sleeve. Instantly, the enormous restriction below him seemed to have a chain reaction, and it actually started to gather together. In the end, a myriad of illusions appeared on the surface of the restriction. The thousands of illusions contained endless suffering. If an ordinary person looked at it, they would probably lose their mind and end their own life. In addition to the endless illusions, the myriad creation sealing array also had an extremely powerful defense. It wasn't a problem at all to trap a heavenly immortal. Even a true immortal would have to weigh his own strength if he wanted to break through this defense. After he laid down the myriad creation sealing array, Elder Gu stomped his right foot, causing the thousands of illusions in the surroundings to instantly vanish and reveal the seven-colored vortex seal once more. Old Man Gu nodded at the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man understood and took a step forward. He laughed and said, "This time, with the help of the ancient all-encompassing sealing formation, subduing that head shouldn't be a problem." As he spoke, the middle-aged man clenched his right hand before curling his finger. The clouds in the horizon crushed down and actually formed an enormous finger that was over 10 kilometers long. The markings on the surface of the finger were extremely clear, and it seemed like a real person's finger. "Starfall finger!" The middle-aged man let out a low roar. He bent his finger and pointed downwards. Instantly, the finger descended like a huge mountain. The moment the finger descended, countless starlights swirled around the finger. It looked dazzling, as if it wasn't a finger that was descending, but a sky full of stars. Zhuan stared at the descending starfall finger and his expression changed slightly. He could sense the extremely terrifying energy contained within the starfall finger. Before this energy, Zhuan seemed so insignificant. In the end, the starfall finger blasted onto the seven-colored vortex and erupted with endless starlight. The starlight was like clusters of nebulae that revolved around the vortex. Its might was even greater than before. Terrifying explosions resounded from the seven-colored vortex. The four fragments surrounding the seven-colored vortex trembled violently. Then countless cracks began to appear on the surface of the four fragments. Moreover, the cracks rapidly spread until they finally collapsed into nothingness. At that moment, the four fragments had disappeared. Only the huge seven-colored vortex and the four 300-meter-long seven-colored vortexes that were attached to it remained. "Old Gu, help me break the last seal," the middle-aged man roared. Old Goo's gaze was solemn. He took a step forward and instantly formed dozens of seals with his right hand. Then, red formations appeared before him. As Old Goo continuously formed hand seals, more and more red formations appeared before him. When the number of red formations reached several thousand, Old Goo's eyes shone with sharpness. Thousand formation image. Old Goo rushed to the middle-aged man's side and pointed with his right hand. Immediately, the seal formed by thousands of red formations was pointed out and landed on the seven-colored vortex. However, the moment the red seal landed on the seven-colored vortex, it immediately erupted with thousands of red formation shadows. In an instant, it completely enveloped the seven-colored vortex and the four smaller ones within it. In an instant, the explosions around the seven-colored vortex became even more violent. Then, cracks began to appear on the surface of the seven-colored vortex. Seeing the cracks, Old Goo and the middle-aged man's eyes were filled with excitement. Soon after, their attacks became even more violent. At that moment, the entire shattered nightmare abyss began to shake violently. The shaking was not localized but spread throughout the entire abyss. If someone stood outside the shattered nightmare abyss, they would clearly feel that the area within hundreds of thousands of miles around the abyss began to shake violently. It was as if a violent earthquake had occurred. The surrounding creatures fled at the sound of it, not daring to stay in the slightest. In the depths of the shattered nightmare abyss, as the middle-aged man and Old Goo worked together, the cracks on the surface of the seven-colored vortex began to spread. In the end, the seven-colored vortex began to completely collapse. The moment the seven-colored vortex collapsed, an extremely terrifying and powerful aura erupted from within. This aura was so terrifying that it seemed to be able to crush the world. Following the eruption of this terrifying aura, an extremely fast black shadow actually flew out from the collapsing seven-colored vortex. This black shadow was very fast. In an instant, it fled in the opposite direction of the middle-aged man and Old Goo. Its speed was even faster than teleportation. This caused the middle-aged man and Old Goo's pupils to shrink. Bang! However, the black shadow didn't manage to escape far before it crashed into the edge of the All-Creation Sealing Array. Immediately, it activated the All-Creation Sealing Array. The All-Creation Sealing Array was extremely powerful. When the black shadow slammed into the edge of the array, it immediately became dizzy and saw stars. It stopped its escape. As soon as the black shadow stopped, its true appearance was finally revealed. Zhuan was surprised to find that the black shadow that escaped from the seven-colored vortex was actually a head. Chapter 1703. The second eye. Moreover, Zhuan also discovered that this head with fluttering white hair had a single eye. Its right eye was tightly shut, and under its eyelid, there was a bloody scar that streaked across its cheek, giving it a rather ferocious appearance. Zhuan stared at the head's tightly shut right eye. He could not help but glance at the eyeball that was playing dead in his arms, and he came to a sudden realization. He guessed that the eyeball was very likely the head's missing right eye. However, he was puzzled. Why did the right eye not return to the head but follow him? Although he was filled with doubts, Zhuan naturally could not pull out the eyeball at such a crucial moment. At this moment, regardless of whether it was the one-eyed head, the middle-aged man, or the old man, they were all extremely terrifying existences. The three of them only needed to pinch their fingers to kill him. He would not bring about his own death by taking out the eyeball. Moreover, the eyeball in his arms was currently playing dead. Its aura had completely vanished. It probably did not want to be found by the head. Who are the two of you? How dare you set up a restriction to prevent me from leaving? The head slowly turned its head. Its white hair fluttered without any wind. Its aura was like a mountain rising from the ground. It suddenly erupted, causing even the sky and earth to change color. Ha! The two of us are the benefactors who broke the seal of the Rainbow Whirlpool and released you. Is this how you treat your benefactors? The middle-aged man's gaze was indifferent, but he was not afraid of the head at all. He took a step forward, and his aura surged out like an erupting volcano. In an instant, the surrounding space froze. If it was not a head but a complete human figure, perhaps the middle-aged man would not dare to fight it. However, it was only a head now, so he was not afraid at all. Beside the middle-aged man, Old Man Goo was not to be outdone either. He advanced together with the middle-aged man. Although his pressure was not as sharp as the middle-aged man's, it was not much weaker. Seeing Old Man Goo and the middle-aged man advancing together, the head's pupils constricted. Old Man Goo and the middle-aged man's aura was not much weaker than his. In a sense, they were even stronger. Damn it. If I hadn't been dismembered by Zhongjie and only have this head left, you two would be nothing more than ants in my eyes. How could I let you two ride on my head? The head said with a fearful gaze. A real man does not boast about his past glory. Back then, you were indeed mighty and awe-inspiring. But now, you are only a head. What can a mere head do to us? The middle-aged man sneered and raised his right finger. Instantly, the falling star finger came crashing down from the sky. Countless stars revolved around the surface of the falling star finger. The falling star finger looked dazzling and powerful. When the falling star finger came crashing down, the head narrowed his eyes and revealed a cautious expression. He snorted coldly and said, "You forced me to do this." After saying that, the head took a deep breath and blew. Although the giant seven-colored whirlpool cracked, the 4 seven-colored whirlpools around it were intact. The moment the head blew, the seven-colored whirlpool closest to the head completely cracked. When the seven-colored whirlpool cracked, a black gas came out from it. The moment the black gas appeared, it transformed into a ferocious phantom of a giant hand. The giant hand was dark and there were many black whirlpools around its arm. It looked as though there were countless black eyes on the arm. It looked quite strange. The phantom of the giant hand suddenly grabbed at the sky. It seemed as though the entire sky was being grabbed by it. It caused the surrounding sky to crack and black cracks to appear in the void. It looked extremely strange. The hand met the falling star finger. When the hand and the finger collided, the entire space seemed to freeze and fell into an extremely quiet state. Of course, this silence did not last for long before it was replaced by continuous explosions. Endless collapses appeared in the void, and these collapses were not intermittent. Instead, they were continuous and unending. The middle-aged man narrowed his eyes and snorted coldly. He gave Old Goo, who was beside him, a look. Old Goo understood and nodded. He formed a seal with his right hand and sent out seals. Countless red arrays appeared. 1,000-array image. Old Goo's right hand struck out in the void. Thousands of red arrays stacked together and formed an extremely deep red mark. The red mark flew out from Old Goo's right hand and imprinted on the giant black hand. Immediately, the giant black hand, which was originally on par with the falling star finger, fell into a state of decline and was even forced to retreat. The head's eyes were extremely gloomy. It took a deep breath and blew again. The second whirlpool exploded and a black mark that was dozens of feet in size flew out from it. The black mark flew out and immediately imprinted on the giant black hand. Immediately, the giant black hand, which had fallen into a state of decline, suddenly exploded with an even more terrifying aura. It actually suppressed the falling star finger and the 1,000-array image. Bang, bang, bang. With the support of the black mark, the giant black hand was much more powerful. The falling star finger did not last long before it completely collapsed. Immediately after, the 1,000-array image also completely shattered. The giant black hand did not lose its momentum. It suddenly landed on the heads of the middle-aged man and Old Goo. It was like a giant hand that covered the sky. It formed a huge black shadow that completely enveloped the two of them. The middle-aged man and Old Goo's expressions turned grave. The middle-aged man curled his right hand again and raised it to the sky. He said in a deep voice, "Meteor finger." As soon as he said that, endless meteors began to fall from the sky with the middle-aged man as the center. Among the countless meteors, a finger surrounded by countless meteors slowly stretched out from the void. This finger was fundamentally different from the falling star finger. The falling star finger surrounded the sky full of stars, but this meteor finger was derived from the meteors. Its power was much stronger than the falling star finger. The meteor finger pressed down and blasted on the giant black hand. It completely stopped the giant black hand from moving forward. The head's eyes were gloomy. It blew out 2 breaths and said coldly, "It seems that if I don't use my final trump card, the 2 of you won't let this go, right? Today, I'll let you 2 ants see my true strength." After blowing out 2 breaths of air, the remaining 2 7-colored vortexes completely collapsed. A large black halberd flew out from one of the 7-colored vortexes. Of course, this large black halberd was just like the large hand. It was also a formless and incorporeal shadow. However, even if it was just a shadow, the aura that the giant halberd displayed was still enough to make people tremble in fear. The space collapsed. The moment the large black halberd was grabbed by the large black hand, it flung out violently. Countless black halberd shadows shot out, enveloping tens of thousands of miles of space. Under the countless halberd shadows, the meteor finger started to tremble, as if it would collapse at any moment. After the giant black halberd flew out, the other 7-colored whirlpool also collapsed. However, after the 7-colored whirlpool collapsed, it was empty. When the white-haired head saw that the 4th whirlpool was empty, his eyes were filled with shock and anger. He couldn't help but roar, "Which damn bastard? How dare he take away my 2nd eye? Who is it?" The white-haired head roared at the sky. However, his eyes quickly locked onto Old Goo and the middle-aged man. He roared, "It must be the 2 of you. What despicable ants. Today, I won't let the 2 of you go." The white-haired head let out a loud cry. Immediately, an extremely dense black fog erupted from its neck. This black fog began to continuously gather and squirm below its neck. Finally, it revealed an extremely muscular body. However, this body was formed by the black fog and looked slightly illusory. The right hand of this body was empty. The white-haired head whistled, and the big hand holding the black halberd suddenly swept over and finally stuck to the right hand of this body. The white-haired head clenched his right hand and a terrifying light immediately erupted from his eyes. He sneered, "Although it's only an illusory body, it's enough to deal with the 2 of you. Hand over your lives. You're looking to die for taking away my 2nd eye." With that, the white-haired head took a step forward and arrived before the middle-aged man and Old Goo in the blink of an eye. He swung his right hand and the giant black halberd suddenly slashed out. It directly slashed towards the middle-aged man and Old Goo. The tip of the halberd shone with a dazzling black light. The black light was like black lightning. As the halberd swept out, it actually exploded. It was as if the entire space would collapse from a single swing of the halberd. The middle-aged man and Old Goo immediately became stern. The middle-aged man pointed with his finger again and said with a deep voice, "Celestial technique, chaotic star cloud finger." With that, extremely large nebulae appeared above the middle-aged man. The nebulae were arranged in an extremely chaotic manner and intertwined with each other. The nebulae intertwined chaotically and vaguely formed the embryonic form of a huge finger. It was as if the nebulae were arranged together to form the shape of a finger. It was completely natural. This finger was also the middle-aged man's ultimate finger. Its power was many times stronger than his previous falling star finger and meteor finger. It was as if the stars in the starry sky would fall from the sky as a result of this finger. Myriad formation image. Old Goo was not to be outdone. In an instant, he formed tens of thousands of red formations. Red ripples spread out as if the surrounding space was completely sealed. It was extremely terrifying. The chaotic star cloud finger and the myriad formation image crushed down together and finally clashed with the white-haired head. Boom, boom, boom. The white-haired head wielded the giant black halberd and swung it. As if it was following some kind of heavenly law, it exploded with shocking energy of heaven and earth. Old Goo remained motionless in the myriad formation image. As for the middle-aged man, he was in the center of the chaotic star cloud finger. Countless nebulae surrounded the middle-aged man, making him look like a god or a demon. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.